Note to listeners: Footnotes will not be read. However, I will indicate page numbers where maps can be found. I will also change the tone slightly when quotes are involved. Foreword. It has been said that fortune always favors the heaviest battalions, or, as Napoleon put it, that "Providence is always on the side of the last reserve." Military history shows no real exceptions to this axiom, that wars are won by superior strength by weight of numbers, if the numbers are properly trained and supplied. The North began the Civil War with all the advantages but two. Her white population outnumbered that of the South by 4 to 1. She had the greater wealth, all the larger industries, the mineral fields, the shipbuilding yards, and all the navy there was. She had all the rank and file of the regular army and 2/3 of the officers. On the other hand, the South had two advantages which nearly gave her the victory. She was much better fitted for military organization than the North. The great majority of her citizens were country people, who could ride and march and shoot; and she had on her side by far the abler generals. The North produced some competent generals in the end: Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Thomas, not to mention McClellan, Buell, and Rosecrans, who fell by the way. But the South had, in Lee and Stonewall Jackson, generals who have had few superiors in the art of war. If Jackson had been at the side of Lee at Gettysburg, the South would probably have won her independence. And Lee ranks with Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Frederick, and Napoleon, as one of the 6 greatest captains of all the ages. It detracts nothing from his glory that he, like Napoleon, finally fell under the accumulated weight of numbers. Notwithstanding all of her many great advantages, however, the North was confronted by a serious problem. 100 years before the outbreak of the Civil War, Chatham had said in the British Parliament, "Conquer a free population of 3,000,000 souls? The thing is impossible." This phrase has become an axiom in politics. The North faced the task of subduing 5.5 million people in deadly earnest, with 3.5 million slaves behind them to do the manual labor, while the whole adult white male population took the field. Was victory possible under these circumstances? It is a popular fallacy that the Great War, which ended nearly a decade ago, superseded, so far as military interest goes, not only Napoleon's campaigns, but our own Civil War. This is not true. Marshal Foch put in practice the main principles that underlay the campaigns of Napoleon. And in the Civil War all the principal strategic and tactical developments of the Great War were foreshadowed. Half a century earlier America had faced most of its problems and brilliantly solved them. While German staff officers have regarded the Civil War as a mere squabble of amateurs, the British Staff College, for 2 generations, has made a careful study of the battles of North and South, and the French General Staff has recently (1925) added the history of the American Civil War to the list of subjects studied at the École de Guerre. It is interesting to note to what an extent technical matters in the earlier contest anticipated the latter. In the combats of the Wilderness, the whole technique of trench warfare was foreshadowed. Cavalry for the first time was used as mounted infantry. Many of the modern weapons of war were originated; and the minor tactics on both sides were curiously like those of today. The Civil War will always possess a fascination to the student of history, if for no other reason, because of the 2 great leaders it produced: Lee on the one side, and Lincoln on the other. To Lee can well be applied the epitaph of Bossuet on Turenne: "He could fight without anger, win without ambition, and triumph without vanity." Lincoln has already passed into legend, and no words can enhance his grandeur. He was one of the 2 or 3 greatest men ever born of Anglo Saxon blood. The Biblical saying, "Of making many books there is no end," well applies to works relating to the Civil War. There are histories, biographies, and memoirs too numerous to mention. A list compiled in 1866 gives over 6,000 titles, and this has been enormously increased in the 60 years which have elapsed since the close of the war. Yet, says Major Steele in his recent book, American Campaigns, Yet there is no single work that covers the whole war concisely and in a way to satisfy the military student. It may seem presumptuous on the part of a civilian to undertake this task, but the writer is emboldened by the words of Arnold, in his Lectures on Modern History, where he says: "There must be a point up to which an unprofessional judgment on a professional subject may not only be competent, but of high authority. The distinction seems to lie originally in the difference between the power of doing a thing, and that of perceiving whether it is well done or not. As to what is generally called strategy, an unprofessional person may, without blame, speak or write on military subjects, and may judge of them sufficiently. The object of the present book is to give a concise military narrative of the principal campaigns of the Civil War. A discussion of the political differences which brought on the great conflict lies entirely outside the scope of this work." Walter Geer, New York, September, 1926. End of foreword. 1. 1861, Fort Sumter. During the first 70 years of the life of this republic, from the adoption of the Constitution in 1789 to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, the control of the government was almost continuously in the hands of the South. Of the first 15 presidents, 8 were from that section of the country, and 5 of these Southern presidents served for 8 years apiece, while not one of the Northern presidents was reelected. Moreover, throughout nearly all this period, the Southerners, with the help of their Northern allies, controlled one or both houses of the Federal Congress; and the major part of the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States were Southerners in every year of its existence. But in 1860 there was a split in the Democratic party, which had so long dominated the 3 branches of the government, and the newly formed Republican party was victorious at the polls. On the 6th of November, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. With the exception of some ballots cast for him in the western part of Virginia, now the State of West Virginia, Lincoln received no votes in the slave States. The great majority of the people of the South sincerely felt that they were in danger of persecution and disaster; that the North wished to ruin them. If the Southerners submitted tamely to Lincoln's election, they must expect to see slavery abolished from Delaware to Texas. Only independence could save them. It was then that the Southern leaders finally determined to leave the Union. Since the founding of the government there had been a difference of opinion between the North and the South on the question of the constitutional position of the States within the Union. In the North, it was generally held that the Union was sovereign, and the States part of it. In the South, the consensus of public opinion was just the opposite. Every man felt that his first allegiance was to his native State. To her he owed not merely devotion, but life itself. From the date of Mr. Lincoln's election, the intention of the people of South Carolina to secede from the Union was clearly shown, and on the 20th of December the State formally took this action. The convention which passed the ordinance of secession at once appointed 3 commissioners to proceed to Washington to treat with the United States government for the delivery of the forts, arsenals, and other property of the government within the limits of South Carolina. It is impossible to imagine what reception these commissioners would have met at Washington, provided there had been no change in the situation at Charleston prior to their arrival at the capital. But on reaching Washington on the morning of the 27th December, they were confronted by a dispatch from Charleston announcing that Major Anderson had transferred his command from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter. Anderson, with 2 small companies, in all about 100 officers and men, had been stationed at Fort Moultrie, on the north side of the harbor of Charleston. The 2 other forts, Castle Pinckney, a small work near the city, and Fort Sumter, erected on a ledge in the middle of the harbor, were not garrisoned. A captain of engineers, Foster, was engaged in putting the latter fort in order for occupancy. Moultrie was commanded by sand hills at a distance of only 160 yards, and was untenable. On the other hand, Sumter was in the middle of the entrance to the harbor, more than a mile from Fort Moultrie on the north, and 2/3 of a mile from Cummings Point on the south. Early in December, Major Buell had been sent from Washington to Major Anderson with verbal instructions, which were afterwards reduced to writing. Anderson was ordered to avoid any act which would tend to provoke aggression, but to hold the forts in the harbor, and, if attacked, to defend himself to the last extremity. On account of the smallness of his force, he was authorized to transfer his command, in case of any act of hostility, to the fort most capable of resistance. He was also authorized to take similar steps whenever he had tangible evidence of a design to proceed to a hostile act. This design Anderson thought that he had discovered, and on the evening of the 26th December, with great skill and address, he transferred his command to Fort Sumter. There can be little question of the fact that he acted entirely within his orders, under the belief that the emergency had arisen which made it his duty to transfer his command to Sumter. That the authorities of South Carolina had not then any intention of attacking or seizing the forts seems to be proved by the presence in Washington of the commissioners sent to treat with the government for their surrender. The commissioners were much excited on receipt of this news. After an interview with Mr. Floyd, the Secretary of War, who assured them that Anderson had violated the understanding given to the South Carolina representatives, they made an attack on the President, charging that the faith of the government had been forfeited by Anderson's conduct. They further insisted that the President should immediately order the evacuation of Charleston harbor by the United States forces. After a very acrimonious correspondence with the President, the commissioners returned to Charleston at the beginning of January. As soon as Anderson's removal to Fort Sumter became known, Governor Pickens seized Castle Pinckney and Fort Moultrie. He then proceeded to repair the damage which Anderson had done to Moultrie on evacuating it, and to put it in condition for use against Sumter, should it become necessary. He also took possession of the arsenal in Charleston, and ordered the construction of batteries on Morris Island and Cummings Point, so as to command the entrance of the harbor, and prevent reinforcements or provisions being sent to Fort Sumter by the government. These steps were most certainly acts of war, and in fact were so regarded at the time by everyone. When the news of these proceedings reached Washington, President Buchanan decided to reinforce Sumter at once. An unarmed steamer, the Star of the West, was chartered by the government and dispatched to Charleston. When this vessel arrived at the entrance of the harbor on the 9th January, it was fired on by the battery on Morris Island, and forced to retire without having reached Fort Sumter. The ship was hit twice, but no one was hurt. Anderson wrote Pickens that, unless this act were promptly disclaimed, he should treat it as an act of war, and the governor replied the same day, assuming entire responsibility. Pickens stated further that he regarded the retention of Sumter by the United States forces as an act of positive hostility. In order to clear up the situation, Anderson informed Pickens that he intended to send an officer to Washington for further instructions. No objections were raised, and Lieutenant Talbot left the same evening. On the 11th January, Pickens sent a formal demand, under a flag of truce, for the surrender of the fort. Anderson refused, but at the same time proposed to send another officer to Washington, accompanied by an envoy to be named by the governor to refer the matter to the President. Pickens assented, and appointed Mr. Hayne the Attorney General of the State. Anderson detailed Lieutenant Hall, and these envoys arrived in Washington on the 13th January. In the meantime, a letter had been received at Washington from Anderson, stating that he had provisions sufficient to last him beyond the 4th of March, and could hold the fort against any force which could be brought against him. The administration of Mr. Buchanan therefore allowed matters to drift until the end of its term of office. For this anomalous situation Anderson himself was in part responsible. His position is stated in a letter written just before the attack on the fort in April. Had I demanded reinforcements while Mr. Holt was in the War Department, I know that he would have dispatched them at all hazards. I did not ask them, because I knew that, the moment it should be known here that additional troops were coming, they would assault me, and thus inaugurate civil war. My policy was to keep still, to preserve peace, to give time for the quieting of the excitement, in the hope of avoiding bloodshed. While these events were taking place at Charleston, the other Cotton and Gulf States were not idle. In January, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana seceded from the Union, and were followed by Texas on the first day of February. On the 8th February, the 7 seceding states organized at Montgomery, Alabama, the Confederate States of America. A month later they adopted a constitution very similar to that of the United States. Jefferson Davis, of Mississippi, was elected president, and Alexander H. Stephens, of Georgia, vice president of the new Confederacy. Both were able men of large experience in public affairs. In view of the critical situation of affairs, Mr. Hayne was advised, on reaching Washington, to postpone his demand for the surrender of Fort Sumter until the end of January. Then, after some exchange of letters, the administration refused the demand, and Hayne left Washington on the 8th of February. Before his departure, he telegraphed Governor Pickens the result of his mission, and the same day orders were issued for making the necessary preparations to bombard Fort Sumter. But this action was prevented for the moment by a resolution passed on the 12th by the Confederate Congress, giving the new government charge of all questions between the several states and the United States government. Under these circumstances, the authorities of South Carolina reluctantly yielded the control of all military operations in Charleston Harbor to the new Confederate government. Mr. Davis wrote Governor Pickens that he would send an engineer of military skill to take charge, and later advised him that General Beauregard had been selected for the position. That officer arrived at Charleston on the 3rd of March. The next day Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated President of the United States. The opportunity of taking Fort Sumter during Mr. Buchanan's administration had passed away. The policy of the new President was plainly declared in his inaugural address. "To the extent of my ability," he said, "I shall take care that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the States." And he closed with the words, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." Few men in America, if any, have been the equals of Lincoln in political sagacity, and the calm, serious tone of warning which pervades the whole address shows the characteristic political ability of its author. One of the first questions considered by the cabinet of President Lincoln was the problem of Fort Sumter. On the 29th March a decision was finally reached, and Governor Pickens was officially informed on the 8th of April that "an attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only; and if such attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made without further notice." This message again shows the political sagacity of Mr. Lincoln. He unquestionably expected that resistance would be made, and he knew that nothing would more certainly arouse the national feeling of the North than an attack made upon Anderson and his little force. On the 11th April, General Beauregard sent to Major Anderson a formal demand for the surrender of Fort Sumter, which was at once refused. At 4:30 on the morning of the 12th of April, 1861, the Confederate batteries opened fire, and the bombardment continued without cessation until the next afternoon. An ineffective reply was made by the guns of the fort until the supply of cartridges gave out. After gallantly defending the post for 2 days, Anderson accepted the honorable terms of surrender which were offered. On Sunday, the 14th, after saluting his flag with 50 guns, Major Anderson, with his command, was conveyed to the fleet waiting outside the bar, and sailed for New York. It is remarkable how little we know of the inner thoughts of the great men of the world, and how different their actions often seem to their contemporaries, and to historians half a century later. It is very difficult at this point of time to understand the mode of reasoning of the Southern leaders in deciding to force the issue of civil war. "A few men more or less at Sumter," writes Professor Channing, "and food for another month or so, would make little difference in the ultimate course of events. But aggressive action on the part of the Confederates would at once bring on the crisis that true policy forbade." The order to open fire on the fort was given, notwithstanding the fact that Anderson had told the Confederate officers who were sent to demand his surrender, that he could not hold out for 2 days if he were not supplied with food. One is amazed today at the lack of political vision shown by the Southern leaders. They little expected the explosion that was to follow. The President's demand for troops to enforce the laws met with a prompt and angry refusal from the border states. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina promptly passed ordinances of secession, and joined the new Confederacy. 3 other states, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, were only kept in the Union by the power of the United States government, and these states furnished many men to the Confederate armies. Thus the lines were finally drawn. 22 states remained united. Opposed to them stood the 11 states which had seceded, and now constituted the Confederate States of America. After the people of Virginia ratified the ordinance of secession on the 23rd of May, the seat of the Confederate government was transferred from Montgomery to Richmond, which continued to be the capital until the end of the war. On land, the theater of the Civil War was bounded on the north by the Potomac, Ohio, and Missouri rivers; on the east and south, by the coasts of the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico; on the west by the frontiers of Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas. With the exceptions of the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg, which were fought a short distance north of the Potomac, all the principal military operations took place within the limits mentioned. The terrain thus bounded, approximately 1,000,000 square miles, was widely diversified in its characteristics. The parallel ranges of the Appalachians, running from northeast to southwest, divided the region between the coast and the Mississippi into 2 nearly equal parts. Within this area was comprised every variety of country: mountains, prairies, forests, swamps. The armies were forced to cope with every possible physical obstacle. The frontiers of the Confederacy were far apart. The coast washed by the Gulf of Mexico is 800 miles south of the Potomac. The Rio Grande, the river boundary of Texas, is 1,700 miles west of Charleston, on the Atlantic. Across this vast expanse of territory there ran but 6 continuous lines of railway. 1. Richmond, Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, connecting the Confederate capital with the ports on the Atlantic. 2. Richmond, Lynchburg, Chattanooga, Memphis, New Orleans, and 3. Richmond, Greensboro, Columbia, Atlanta, Pensacola, connecting Richmond with the Mississippi and the Gulf. 4. Louisville, Nashville, Chattanooga, Atlanta, Mobile. 5. Cairo, Corinth, Mobile. And 6. Cairo, Memphis, New Orleans, connecting the Ohio with the Gulf of Mexico. The railroads of the South were not only few in number, but they were also badly laid out for the strategic demands of the war. The lines were short, and were broken at frequent intervals because of the refusal of important cities to let them pass through. Between Richmond and Savannah there were half a dozen changes. The most serious break was at Petersburg, where the line from Richmond stopped at the western edge, and the road to Wilmington began at the southern limit. Some of the gaps were filled during the war, but not in time to do much good. As it was impossible to manufacture new rails, those which gave out were replaced by rails taken from less important routes of traffic. It was the same with the rolling stock. In 1864, the Quartermaster General stated that a train could not run more than 100 miles a day on the main line from Richmond to Georgia, and that a car could not go 500 miles without breaking down. On the other hand, the North in 1861 was oversupplied with railroads, and many of them were on the verge of bankruptcy. The owners were glad to place them at the disposal of the government, and the military engineers rebuilt them as fast as they came under federal control. The soldiers acquired so much skill in making repairs that by 1864 it was an almost futile operation for the Confederates to break a railroad line. As a striking example of the efficiency with which the Northern lines were handled, we may mention the transfer in 3 weeks' time of Schofield's Army of the Ohio, 30,000 strong, from Tennessee to the coast of North Carolina, after the battle of Nashville in December, 1864. The wagon roads in the Southern states were few and poor. There were no paved highways such as connect the principal places in Europe. But there were numerous navigable streams. Towns were few and far between. Food and forage were not easily obtainable. The great rivers were bridged at rare intervals. Except over a comparatively small area, the Union armies met the same obstacles as did the soldiers of Cromwell and Turenne. The city of Atlanta, the heart of the Confederacy, was 60 days' march from the Potomac, the same distance as Vienna from the Channel, or Moscow from the Niemen. New Orleans was 36 days' march from the Ohio, the same distance as Berlin from the Moselle. Had Napoleon, in the campaign against Russia, remained for the winter at Smolensk, and firmly established himself in Poland, writes Colonel Henderson, Moscow might have been captured and held during the ensuing summer. But the occupation of Moscow would not have ended the war. Russia in many respects was not unlike the Confederacy. She had given no hostages to fortune in the shape of rich commercial towns. She possessed no historic fortresses, and so offered but few objectives to the invader. If defeated or retreating, her armies could always find refuge in distant fastnesses. The climate was severe, the internal trade inconsiderable. To bring the burden of war home to the mass of the population was difficult, and to hold the country by force was impracticable. Such were the difficulties which the genius of Napoleon was powerless to overcome, and Napoleon invaded Russia with 500,000 of seasoned soldiers. Note: a detailed map can be found on page 13. The conquest of the 11 seceding states, which the federal government was about to undertake with an army of 75,000 volunteers, and without the least preparation, was in truth a gigantic undertaking. Without a trained staff, and an efficient administration, an army is incapable of movement. It is no small task to keep a marching column supplied with food and forage, and the problem of transport taxes the ability of the most experienced commander. A march of 100 miles into an enemy's country seems like an easy feat, but unless every detail has been carefully thought out, it may be more disastrous than a lost battle. During the first 5 weeks of the Russian campaign between the Niemen and Vilna, a distance of only 60 miles, Napoleon lost 1/3 of his army from disease. Says Henderson, "To handle an army in battle is much less difficult than to bring it on to the field in good condition." Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was situated less than 100 miles south of Washington. This necessarily made Virginia the seat of the war in the East. The South undoubtedly made a mistake in placing her capital so near the frontier. Chattanooga or Atlanta would have been a better choice. But the Union capital was actually on the boundary line. Batteries on Arlington Heights would render Washington untenable. The capture of either of the capitals might have momentous consequences, and prove decisive of the contest. These facts had a controlling influence on the general strategy of the Civil War. The objects aimed at by the opposing armies in Virginia were: 1. The protection of their own capital; 2. The capture of the enemy's capital; and 3. The defeat of the opposing army. The approaches to the national capital were blocked only by the Potomac River; and the entrenched line on the south bank, opposite the city, could easily be turned by marching down the Shenandoah Valley. This avenue for the invasion of the North ran from about the center of Virginia in a northeasterly direction to Harper's Ferry, where the Potomac was easily passable. Throughout all this distance it was feasible, by guarding the mountain passes, or gaps, as they were generally called, to prevent interference by the Federal forces. The valley was fertile and possessed good turnpikes. From Lexington, at its head, to the Potomac, the valley was 140 miles long by about 24 miles wide. Its chief town and strategic center was Winchester, about 26 miles southwest of Harper's Ferry. From Winchester 2 highways lead westward by Romney and Moorfield. 4 lead east and southeast, passing the Blue Ridge by Snickers, Ashby's, Manassas, and Chester Gaps. Through Manassas Gap ran the railroad connecting Front Royal in the valley with Richmond via Manassas Junction. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the main connection between Washington and the West, crossed the Potomac at Harper's Ferry, and followed the course of the river for a distance of 120 miles within the confines of Virginia. On the other hand, the Shenandoah Valley offered no special advantages as a route for the Federal invader. It led away from Richmond, and the Union forces were liable to be taken in flank, or to have their line of communication cut by way of the lower gaps. It would therefore be no easy matter to debouch from the valley and occupy Gordonsville, the key to the railway system of central Virginia. The population of the 22 states which adhered to the Union was over 22 millions. That of the 11 seceding states was but little over 9 millions, of whom about 3 millions and a half were slaves. The slaves, however, instead of being a source of anxiety to the South, as many in the North predicted, proved entirely trustworthy and faithful. They raised the crops upon which the whole South subsisted during the war, and they were largely employed in building fortifications. Regarding the relative numbers of the combatants on the two sides, there are wide differences of opinion. While the Federal statistics are quite complete, official figures are lacking in the case of the Confederacy. Colonel Livermore, who is considered an authority on the question, concludes that there were over 1.5 million on the Union side as against 1 million among the Confederates. Colonel Wood, a Southern writer, puts the Confederate levies at no more than 600,000. As there could not have been more than 1 million men of age for military service in the South, the latter estimate is probably nearer correct. There is no doubt, however, that the Union armies were vastly superior, not only in numbers, but even more in resources and equipment. To offset these advantages, the North labored under many disadvantages. It was generally acting on the offensive in a hostile country, where large detachments were necessary as the armies advanced to maintain communications and hold the territory gained. The self-sustaining power of the South was far greater than has usually been imagined. The area under cultivation was almost equal to that north of the Potomac and the Ohio. The amount of livestock, horses, mules, cattle, and sheep, was actually larger than in the North; and the shortage of the wheat crop was more than balanced by the great harvests of rice and corn. But in material prosperity, the North was far in advance of the South. In accumulated capital there was no comparison between the two sections. The North was full of manufactories of all kinds. The South had very few of any kind. In the North there was also a much larger measure of practical business capacity. The command of the sea naturally fell at once into the hands of the North. All the navy yards, except those at Norfolk and Pensacola, and the entire personnel of the navy, with the exception of a few officers, remained under the control of the government. Moreover, the mercantile marine of the United States, which in 1861 was second only to that of Great Britain, was almost wholly owned in the North. The gravity of the coming struggle was realized by neither party. Men of high ability at the North prophesied that the South would be brought back into the Union within 90 days. Only General Scott declared that its conquest might be achieved "in 2 or 3 years by a young able general, a Wolfe, a Desaix, a Hoche, with 300,000 disciplined men kept up to that number." Notwithstanding the absolute lack of factories and foundries in the South, and the inability to manufacture cannon, powder, and ammunition, the orders first placed in Europe by the Confederate government were on a trivial scale. Before the war, metals, machinery, rails, rolling stock, salt, and even medicine came mainly from the North. The principal staples of the South, cotton and tobacco, brought leather and cloth in exchange from England. There was but one way in which the South could have procured the means of buying abroad the material of every kind of which she stood so greatly in need. Had the government promptly seized all the cotton in the country, paying for it the market price in Confederate money, sent it to England before the blockade was firmly established, and there stored it, to be sold as occasion required, available funds would have been secured to meet the largest requirements. But this wise course, though suggested, was not adopted. The majority of the Southern politicians thought that England and France, a large portion of whose population depended for their livelihoods on the harvests of the South, would not brook interference with their trade, and would never allow the North to enforce the blockade. In the War of Independence, the fleets of France and Spain had come to the assistance of the struggling Americans, and compelled England to let her colonies go. Therefore it was not likely that the North, confronted by the naval strength of England and France, would fail to yield. But in forecasting the future, the history of the past is not always an infallible guide. Virginia, the most important state south of Mason and Dixon's line, was not a member of the Confederacy when the government was established at Montgomery. Her people did not regard the election of a Republican president as a menace, and were not strongly in favor of the secession movement. Many of her leading citizens deprecated the hasty action of South Carolina, and during the earlier months of 1861 there were few signs of unrest. But the crisis was not long postponed. When President Lincoln called upon the state to furnish her quota of troops for the Federal army, Virginia promptly seceded, and as already stated, her action was followed by Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. As soon as the Richmond Convention passed the ordinance of secession on the 17th of April, 1861, nearly all the officers in the regular army from that state sent in their resignations, and offered their services to the Confederate government. A few officers only, of whom the most distinguished were Lieutenant General Scott and Major (afterwards Major General) George H. Thomas, remained loyal to the Union. Among the officers who then left the Union service were the two most famous soldiers of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee and Thomas J. Jackson. Lee was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, 19 January, 1807. He was the son of General Henry Lee, familiarly known as Light Horse Harry, of Revolutionary fame. His mother, Ann Carter of Shirley on the James River, was a direct descendant of Robert Carter, who because of his vast landed possessions and high social position was called King Carter. The Lees were of the oldest, wealthiest, and most patriotic families in Virginia. The original ancestor was Richard Lee, who settled in the Old Dominion as early as 1640. After the Revolution, General Harry Lee served in the Congress of the United States, and was 3 times governor of Virginia. In his funeral oration on the occasion of the death of Washington, he pronounced the immortal words so familiar to every American: "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen." Harry Lee died when his son Robert was only 11 years of age. The family, which seems to have had some financial reverses, had moved to Alexandria, where Robert was placed in school, and worshipped in the same church that Washington had attended. At the age of 18 he entered West Point on an appointment secured for him by General Andrew Jackson. He graduated second in his class, and for the next 5 years served in the Engineer Corps. In June, 1831, Robert Lee married Mary Custis, a great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, and the heiress to the beautiful estate of Arlington, on the banks of the Potomac. The Mexican War gave Lee his first opportunity to show his great military talents. General Scott made him chief of staff, and for distinguished services he received the brevet rank of colonel. After the war, General Scott declared that Robert E. Lee was the greatest living soldier in America. In 1852 he was appointed superintendent of the Military Academy, where he made a fine record during his 3 years of service. In 1861 Lee was colonel of the 5th Cavalry in Texas, and was generally considered the ablest officer in the army. He was recalled to Washington, and on the 18th of April was offered by President Lincoln the command of the Army of the United States, which he declined. He resigned his commission on the 20th April, and 3 days later took command at Richmond of the military forces of Virginia. Though opposed to secession, and deprecating war, Lee felt that he could take no part in the coercion of the Southern States. When the issue was drawn, like so many other men of the South, he considered his allegiance to his native state paramount to his loyalty to the nation. In personal appearance and in character, there was a marked contrast between Lee and his great lieutenant Jackson. Lee was tall, handsome, of distinguished manners and courtly address. He was a patrician born and bred. Jackson also was tall, but his form was ungainly, his hands and feet enormous. He was a true son of the soil. He was born on the 21st of January, 1824, in the little town of Clarksburg, now the county seat of Harrison, but then no more than a village in the Virginia backwoods. His father was a lawyer, clever and popular, who had inherited a comfortable patrimony. Generous and incautious, he found it easier to make money than to keep it, and when he died in 1827, every vestige of his property was swept away. The young widow married again, but lived only a year longer, and at the age of 7 the boy Thomas found himself a penniless orphan. In 1842, when he was 18 years of age, a vacancy occurred in the military academy at West Point, which was to be filled by a youth from the congressional district, in which Clarksburg was included, and young Jackson sought and obtained the appointment. Owing to his lack of previous training, Jackson's career at West Point was not distinguished, but by application and hard work, he finally succeeded in graduating 17th in a class of 70, and his rank gave him a commission in the artillery. During the 4 years of his stay at West Point, the young Virginian gained in health and strength, and attained his full height of 5 feet 10. He acquired the erect bearing of the cadets, but never overcame his natural awkwardness, and was always a poor horseman. There was much in the boyhood of Jackson, as there was much in his later career, that recalls Napoleon to mind. Both were devoted to their families. Both were indefatigable students. Both were provincial. Neither was prepossessing. They both had the same love of method and of order. An inflexibility of purpose, an absolute disregard of popular opinion, and an unswerving belief in their own capacity were predominant traits in both. Neither sought sympathy, and both felt that they were masters of their own fate. The sobriquet of "Stonewall," by which Jackson will always be known, was really a misnomer. Undoubtedly he could be steadfast on occasions, but he was stronger in offense than in defense. Like the great Corsican, the quality which above all others marked him was mobility, a swiftness in action which puzzled and generally confounded his adversaries, and which usually secured for him success. Jackson was fortunate from the beginning of his military career. Before the Mexican War, the total strength of the regular army was not more than 8,500 men, and nearly all this force was scattered in small detachments along the frontier to control the Indian tribes. This warfare was monotonous, and there was but little chance to attain military distinction. The first artillery to which Jackson was attached was ordered to the Rio Grande, and later was included in Scott's army of invasion. Jackson distinguished himself in several engagements, and came out of the war a major by brevet. None of his West Point comrades had made so great a stride in rank, and his future in his profession was assured. Many of the generals with whom Jackson was later to be intimately connected, either as friends or enemies, are mentioned in Scott's dispatches. Magruder, Ambrose Hill, McDowell, and Hooker belonged to his own regiment. McClellan and Beauregard served on the staff with Lee. Joseph E. Johnston, twice severely wounded, was conspicuous for his gallantry. Pope was a staff officer. Longstreet was bracketed with Pickett for conspicuous conduct. Porter and Reno did good service with the artillery, and Ewell had 2 horses killed under him at Churubusco. After the war, Jackson's battery was sent to Fort Hamilton on Long Island, 7 miles below New York. 2 years passed without incident, and then Jackson was transferred to Florida, where his stay was brief. In March, 1851, he was appointed professor of artillery tactics and natural philosophy at the Virginia Military Institute. This college, founded 12 years previously on the model of West Point, was located at Lexington, 100 miles west of Richmond. It was attended by several hundred youths from Virginia and other Southern states, and was the training school of many Confederate officers. In all essential respects, the Military Institute was then but little behind West Point. The discipline was as strict, the drill but little less precise. In the well-stocked library of the Institute, Jackson found every opportunity to increase his professional knowledge. He was an untiring reader, and the campaigns of Napoleon were his constant study. He was an enthusiastic admirer of the genius of the Emperor. The swiftness, the daring, and the energy of his movements appealed to Jackson's every instinct. 10 years passed quickly away, and here we find him at the outbreak of the Civil War. Marked intellectual capacity is the chief characteristic of the most famous soldiers. Ney and Blucher were probably the best fighting generals of France and Prussia, but neither was capable of conducting a campaign. Caesar, Frederick, and Napoleon were each and all of them more than mere fighting men. No one of their time rivaled them in strength of intellect. It was this, combined with the best qualities of Ney and Blucher, that made them masters of strategy, and lifted them high above those who were tacticians and nothing more. and it was this that Jackson cultivated at Lexington. Finally, in estimating the relative power of the parties to this conflict, we must take into consideration their respective aptitudes for war. The South undoubtedly possessed a more military population than the North. Not only Virginia, but South Carolina, Louisiana, and other Southern states, possessed excellent military academies. A martial spirit was also cultivated by the conditions of life in the South: riding, hunting, fishing, unusual physical exertions. The aristocratic regime of the slave-holding states was also conducive to a preference for military, rather than civil pursuits, and the young men of the better classes eagerly embraced the profession of arms. They made excellent officers, while those below them in the social scale made admirable soldiers. In the North, on the other hand, there was very little of this enthusiasm for military life. The people there were too busy with schemes for the development of the country, and for the acquisition of private fortunes. The organization of the Confederate army from the first was superior to that of the Federals. Although a few civilians were appointed to the rank of brigadier general, all the chief commands were reserved for the graduates of West Point. The Confederate armies were commanded by officers of the full rank of general; the corps by lieutenant generals; the divisions by major generals; and the brigades by brigadier generals. Distinction of rank was uniformly based upon extent of command, as it ought always to be. In the Union army, on the other hand, armies, army corps, or divisions, indifferently, were commanded by major generals, to the general detriment of the service. Even General Scott was merely a lieutenant general by brevet, and it was not until the autumn of 1863 that he was given the full rank of lieutenant general. The grade of general was not created until 1866. Ignorance of military affairs, and an unworthy jealousy of distinctions of rank, which have always marked our public men, were probably at the bottom of this unwise policy. The Confederacy was fortunate also, at the start, in having the services of some of the most efficient men in the "old army." Adjutant General Cooper, Quartermaster General Joseph E. Johnston, and Commissary General Northrop. Also Colonel Josiah Gorgas, who showed great genius in building up the ordnance service; as well as, in the field, those excellent organizers and disciplinarians, P.G.T. Beauregard and Braxton Bragg. So well did they all do their work, that there were remarkably few changes in the personnel of the higher ranks of the Confederate army from the beginning until the close of the war. The only officer to come to the front at a later date was Robert E. Lee, who did not become prominent until the second year of the conflict. As General Cooper never served in the field, his name is not so familiar to the general public; but those who were in a position to know what he did, will not fail to place him among those who contributed most to whatever was achieved. End of Chapter 1. 2. April through July, 1861, Manassas. Part 1. When the flag was fired on at Fort Sumter, the nation was powerless to resent the insult. The military establishment was reduced to 13,000 men scattered in distant garrisons. There was no reserve, no transport, no organization for war. The navy consisted of 6 screw frigates, only one of which was in commission; of 5 steam sloops, some 20 sailing ships, and a few gunboats. Although well armed, the majority of the vessels were out of date, and 9,000 officers and men constituted the extent of the personnel. The news of the firing on Sumter reached Washington on Saturday, the 13th of April. The following morning, while Anderson was preparing to evacuate the fort, the President called a special meeting of his cabinet to discuss the situation. With his own hand, Lincoln immediately drafted a proclamation calling forth the militia of the several states to the number of 75,000 men, to cause the laws to be duly executed; also convening both houses of Congress in special session on the 4th day of July. This proclamation was published throughout the country on Monday morning, 15th of April. Its effect in the North was instantaneous and universal. All uncertainty was at an end. The people were ready for war, and the response was simply magnificent. Only the "Old Bay State," however, was prepared. For several months Governor Andrew had been giving special attention to the equipment and drill of the state militia, and 5,000 men were ready, of whom 3,000 were fully armed. Within 24 hours the 6th Massachusetts mustered on Boston Common and started for Washington. The regiment reached Baltimore on the 19th April, a date again to be made memorable by the shedding of the first blood in a great American war. In crossing the city between the two stations, which was necessary at that time, the regiment was attacked by a mob of Southern sympathizers, and several lives were lost on both sides. A few hours later the regiment reached Washington, and took up its quarters in the Senate chamber at the Capitol. Until then the city had been guarded only by a small force of regulars and a few companies of local volunteers. The 8th Massachusetts at once followed, under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin F. Butler, well known in Boston as a lawyer and politician, of rather unsavory reputation, who was now become a national character. As the bridge across the Susquehanna at Havre de Grace had been burned, the regiment made its way by steamer to Annapolis, where it met the full and handsomely equipped 7th Regiment of New York. The arrival of these two regiments at Washington for the moment put an end to all apprehension. Without waiting for the meeting of Congress on the 3rd of May, the President very wisely called for 42,034 volunteers for 3 years, for 22,714 men for the regular army, and for 18,000 men for the navy. These men, when enrolled, with the 75,000 previously called out, would raise the available army to 156,861 troops, and the navy to 25,600 men. In his message to Congress on the 4th of July, the President recommended that this number be increased to 400,000 men. In these acts and recommendations Mr. Lincoln showed a comprehension of the magnitude of the task before him, which was hardly to be expected from his lack of experience. The work of organizing and directing these forces was at first entrusted to Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, a veteran of 2 wars, but now past his 80 years and 10, and incapacitated by bodily infirmities. Though born in Virginia, he had remained loyal to the Union, and his sound military judgment was of great advantage to the government at this time. The old general was loath to sheathe his sword, but his health soon forced him to resign from active service. Out of the 1,200 graduates of West Point, who at the beginning of 1861 were still fit for service, a fourth were Southerners, and these, almost without exception, cast their lot with the Confederacy. The defection of Robert E. Lee in particular was a sad blow to General Scott, and a great loss to the Union cause. It was necessary to relieve from active duty many other senior officers in the regular army, who were too old for service in the field, and their places should have been filled by promoting the most capable and promising of the younger officers. Unfortunately, however, the President in making many of his appointments was governed too much by political considerations. In the East, Butler and Banks, both men without any kind of military training or experience, were made major generals of volunteers; while in the West, Fremont was appointed a major general in the regular army, and succeeded in Missouri the brave and capable Lyon, to whose courage and skill the preservation of that state to the Union was largely due. On the 24th of May, after the people of Virginia had ratified the ordinance of secession, the Federal troops crossed the Potomac without opposition, and occupied Arlington Heights and Alexandria. A camp was established on the south side of the river, and the line was entrenched from the Chain Bridge to Alexandria. Brevet Major McDowell, then on duty with the War Department, whose highest rank of command had been lieutenant of artillery, was made a brigadier general, and placed in command of the forces in Virginia. Washington now being safe from attack, the Northern newspapers and public began to cry out for a forward movement before the expiration of the term of service of the 3 months' men. General Scott wanted to wait until the men of the second levy could be made ready for the field. But in the face of the newspaper clamor, the government was finally forced to overrule the judgment of the lieutenant general, and he was ordered to make the necessary arrangements for an advance. The military situation at this time was as follows. The main army of the Confederacy, 20,000 volunteers under General Beauregard, was stationed at Manassas Junction, 30 miles southwest of Washington. Beauregard, a classmate of McDowell at West Point, had been an officer in the Engineers, and the capture of Fort Sumter had added much renown to his already excellent reputation. At Manassas Junction, on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, a branch line, coming from Front Royal in the Shenandoah Valley, connected with the main line to Richmond. Near Winchester, in the lower Shenandoah Valley, General Joseph E. Johnston, with about 11,000 men, confronted a Union force of some 18,000, under General Patterson, a veteran of the Mexican War. Although nearly 70 years old, he had recently been appointed a major general of volunteers from civil life, and given this important command. At Aquia Creek, 30 miles southeast of Manassas, there was a Confederate force of 3,000 men under General Holmes. At Fort Monroe, a small Federal force under General Butler was opposed by Generals Huger and Magruder. All the Confederate detachments were under the direction of President Davis at Richmond, who seems to have had General Lee as his military adviser, while General Scott under President Lincoln commanded the Union forces at Washington. There were two main roads running south from the national capital, one from Alexandria to Richmond via Fredericksburg, the other by way of Warrenton. The strategic importance of Manassas was due to the fact that it was located on the Warrenton Turnpike and on the main line of railway from Washington to the Southern States. Beauregard's position there also guarded the junction of the branch line to the Shenandoah Valley, by which Johnston's army communicated with the Confederate base at Richmond. Manassas Junction lies on a high, open plateau. The Confederate position was protected by some slight fieldworks armed with 50 heavy guns. To the north and east of Manassas, at a distance of about 3 miles, flows Bull Run, with wooded heights in most places close to the banks. The stream is winding and sluggish, and fordable in many places, although here and there the banks are steep and rocky. The Confederate army guarded the various fords, extending on a line about 8 miles long from the stone bridge on the Warrenton road to the railway. In reluctant response to the popular cry for a forward movement, Scott asked McDowell to submit a plan of operations, and he complied on the 24th of June. His plan was to turn the enemy's position, and force him out of it by seizing or threatening his communications. He counted upon Patterson and Butler to contain the forces in their respective fronts. Estimating that Beauregard would still receive reinforcements enough to raise his army to about 35,000 men, McDowell thought that he should have a force of 30,000 of all arms, with a reserve of 10,000. At the same time he urged that he might be allowed to put his regiments into brigades. This fact of itself shows the very rudimentary state of the Union army. McDowell's plan was fully discussed, and finally approved at a council of war held on the 29th June at the Executive Mansion, in which took part the President, his cabinet, and the principal military officers. McDowell stated emphatically that he could not hope to beat the two Confederate armies if united, and Scott gave him the positive assurance, "If Johnston joins Beauregard, he shall have Patterson at his heels." It is perhaps unnecessary to state that the operation upon which the Federal authorities had decided was a complicated one, which should never have been undertaken with inexperienced generals and raw troops. It was tempting fortune to subject the issue of arms to the success of a cooperative movement. Instead of relying upon Patterson's ability to detain Johnston in the Shenandoah Valley, the bulk of his army should have been brought to Washington as soon as it was decided to make the forward movement. For this failure General Scott was largely responsible. McDowell was ordered to begin his movement on the 8th of July. But owing to various delays it was not until a week later that his force was raised to the stipulated strength. On the 16th July, McDowell issued his orders to march that afternoon. His army was organized as follows: 1st Division, Tyler. Brigades, Keyes, Schenck, Sherman, Richardson, 9,936. 2nd Division, Hunter. Brigades, Porter, Burnside, 2,648. 3rd Division, Heintzelman. Brigades Franklin, Wilcox, and Howard, 9,777. 4th Division, Runyon. No brigade commanders, 5,752. 5th Division, Miles, Brigades, Blenker and Davies, 6,207, for a total of 34,320. There were also 7 troops of regular cavalry and 8 companies of infantry under Major Sykes. There were 49 guns, and 7 of the batteries were also of the regular army. McDowell's force aggregated 35,000 men, but Runyon's division was held back to guard the line of communications, and took no part in the Battle of Manassas. On the field, therefore, McDowell had only 30,000 men. Through his spies in Washington, Beauregard was kept informed of the Federal plans, and on the 17th July he telegraphed to Richmond that the advance had begun. Davis immediately ordered Johnston and Holmes to Manassas. That same day, Patterson, after advancing within 9 miles of Winchester, retired to Charlestown, and telegraphed General Scott that Johnston's force was 35,000 strong, although in fact it was not more than 2/3 the strength of his own. This left Johnston free to depart, and on the 18th he marched his army by way of Ashby's Gap to Piedmont, where the infantry was placed in railway cars, while the cavalry and artillery proceeded by road. On the afternoon of the 20th July, he had joined Beauregard with the bulk of his forces. It is hardly worth while to go into the details of the story of Patterson's failure to fulfill the expectations of his chief. As Mr. Ropes says, he was really more to be pitied than blamed. If Scott expected that Patterson would fight Johnston, as he says he did, he should have given him orders to that effect, and he cannot be exonerated from blame for not having done so. McDowell began his advance from Alexandria on the afternoon of the 16th July, and on the morning of the 18th, the greater part of his force of 35,000 men was concentrated at Centreville, 22 miles from Washington, and 5½ miles northeast of Manassas. It should have been possible to have attacked the following morning, but the Federal commander was confronted by many obstacles. The maps were poor, and it was impossible to secure local guides. The army was much larger than any ever assembled on the American continent. The general, his staff, and the troops were alike inexperienced. To deploy 10,000 or 20,000 men for attack is a difficult operation, even with well-drilled troops and an experienced staff, says Colonel Henderson. The troops had received no instruction in musketry, and many of the regiments went into action without having once fired their rifles. Ignorance of war and contempt for the lessons of history were to cost the nation dear. In McDowell's report, he states that it was his intention to attack at once, but he could not get the troops into line earlier than he did. The men were not accustomed to marching, and the supply trains moved with difficulty and in disorder, so that there was a day's delay in getting the provisions forward. Beauregard's army, then called the Army of the Potomac, consisted of 6½ brigades. It was posted in a line about 8 miles long behind Bull Run, from the stone bridge on the Warrenton Pike to Union Mills Ford. The bridge was held by Evans' half brigade, and the fords to the east by the brigades of Cocke, Bonham, Longstreet, Jones, and Ewell, with Early in the rear. Holmes, on his arrival, was placed in reserve, as were also the brigades of Jackson, Bee, and Bartow, of Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah, when they came on the field. From these arrangements it is evident that Beauregard expected the Federals to attempt to cross the creek by the fords to the east of the stone bridge. This was indeed McDowell's first intention, but he gave it up on account of the difficulty of an attack on that side. Centreville is on an elevation from which the ground slopes in all directions. The Warrenton Pike runs almost due west, and good dirt roads lead to all the fords. The country toward Bull Run is cut up by small streams, and covered with farms and thick woods, which furnish good cover for troops. On the morning of the 18th, McDowell ordered Tyler, whose division was in the lead, to make a reconnaissance, but strictly enjoined him not to bring on an engagement. Tyler advanced along the road to Mitchell's Ford, and opened fire with artillery on the Confederate forces posted on the south side of the stream. He also sent forward 2 regiments of infantry and a squadron of cavalry into the thick woods along the creek. The troops of Bonham and Longstreet returned the Federal fire at short range, and the Union forces were driven back in disorder. This first affair, small as it was, had a very depressing effect upon McDowell's army, and greatly encouraged the Confederates. This experience confirmed McDowell's impression that it was impossible with his raw troops to carry the line of Bull Run by a frontal attack. His stay of 2 days at Centreville, necessitated by the impossibility of concentrating sooner his loosely organized force, had given time for his engineers to examine the position of the enemy, and on their report he decided to turn the Confederate left by making a detour to the northwest with his right wing. Unaware of the fact that Johnston was already on his way to join Beauregard, he also hoped to prevent their junction by destroying the railway to the valley. McDowell's orders, issued on Saturday, the 20th July, were as follows: Miles' division, with 1 brigade of Tyler's division, and a strong force of artillery, was to remain in reserve at Centreville, and to threaten Blackburn's Ford. The rest of Tyler's division, with 4 batteries of regular artillery, was to advance along the turnpike, and make a secondary attack at daybreak by way of the Stone Bridge. The divisions of Hunter and Heintzelman, about 13,000 men in all, were to make the turning movement. They were to march along the pike to a point 2 miles west of Centreville, there to take a road through the woods to the right, cross Bull Run at Sudley Springs, and move down upon the flank and rear of the enemy. 5 batteries, 24 guns in all, were to accompany this column, the whole under the personal command of General McDowell. As soon as this movement had forced the left of Beauregard's army away from the Stone Bridge, Tyler was to cross and join in the main attack. The division of Miles, 6,200 strong, was to remain near Centreville to guard the communications of the army. As anticipated, no resistance was encountered at Sudley Springs, but the turning column was delayed in starting by Tyler's division getting in the way, and did not reach the ford until 9 o'clock Sunday morning, instead of 7 as was calculated. Note: there is a corresponding map on page 33. After fording the creek and resting perhaps half an hour, the troops resumed their march in a southerly direction. They had proceeded about a mile when the enemy was encountered, posted on some heights near the Matthews House, north of the Warrenton road. This was about 10:30. These troops were part of the demi brigade of General Evans, which held the extreme left of the Confederate line. Evans, who was an officer of the old army and a good soldier, had soon divined that the Federal attack on the Stone Bridge was only a feint. And before long, he suspected that a movement to his left flank was in progress. His suspicions were confirmed by a courier from a picket of Sudley Springs, and by a "wigwag" message from Beauregard's signal officer, Captain E. P. Alexander. Leaving 4 companies and 2 guns to defend the bridge, and sending word to Cocke on his right, Evans marched the rest of his command, 11 companies and 2 guns to the left, and took up a strong position on high ground about 3/4 of a mile north of the pike, with his left resting on the Sudley road. On Johnston's arrival the day before, in virtue of his superior rank, he had taken command of the Confederate army, but he wisely left the actual direction of the troops to Beauregard. The latter had formed an ambitious plan of crossing by the lower fords, turning the left of the Federals and cutting off their line of retreat. In fact, the 2 generals waited from 8:30 to 10:30, Sunday morning, on a hill in the rear of Mitchell's Ford for this movement to begin. But the order to Ewell, who was to have been the first to cross, had miscarried, and now, as General Beauregard himself puts it, the enemy was about to annihilate the left flank of the Confederate army, and had to be met and checked there, for otherwise all would have been lost. After dispatching orders for the 2 brigades of Holmes and Early to move upward to the Warrenton pike, Johnston and Beauregard set off at a rapid gallop to join their troops engaged 4 miles away. Ewell, Jones, and Longstreet, at the same time, were ordered "to make a strong demonstration all along their front on the other side of the run," says Johnston. Upon finding Evans drawn up before him, Burnside promptly formed a regiment in line of battle and attacked. Other regiments came forward one after another and were repulsed. There was lack of concert and combined power. The Federal tactics were poor and timid. Porter came to the support of Burnside, but Evans maintained his position alone for more than an hour. Then he was reinforced by the brigades of Bee and Bartow; and from the Henry House Hill, Imboden's battery lent its aid. Meanwhile the leading regiments of Heintzelman's division had come up, and prolonged the Federal line to the right. Part of both the hostile lines was in the woods and part in the open fields, and at some points the lines were only 100 yards apart. Soon after the arrival of Bee and Bartow, with their 4 regiments, the right of the Confederate position was taken in flank and rear by the brigades of Sherman and Keyes of Tyler's division. Under the mistaken impression that the stone bridge was mined, and defended by a heavy abatis, the Federal troops had found fords and crossed Bull Run about halfway between the bridge and Sudley. Thus enveloped on their right after having maintained their position for over 2 hours against superior numbers, the Confederates at last gave way and fled in confusion across Young's Branch. In the angle south of the turnpike there is a commanding ridge called the Henry House Hill, generally level on top, and some 200 yards across. The inner edge of the ridge afforded some cover both from view and from fire, and formed a good position for a defensive line of battle. Gentle slopes led down from the hill to the valley of Young's Branch. But they were cut up by little ravines, and partly covered with patches of young pines. Upon the northwest brow of the plateau stood the Henry House, and a third of a mile northeast of it, on a projecting spur, was the Robinson House, surrounded by dense trees and shrubbery. Both houses were small frame buildings, and neither had any defensive strength. At the rear of the plateau, along the eastern borders, was a thick fringe of young pines, which merged into a dense oak woods of considerable extent, lying on both sides of the Sudley Manassas road. Jackson, who had marched to the sound of the firing, had formed his brigade in the edge of the pines along the eastern brow of the plateau. He was just in time to support Imboden's battery, which, badly cut to pieces, was withdrawing from the fight. At this moment appeared General Bee. He was covered with dust and sweat, his horse foaming. "General," he said, "they are beating us back." "Then, sir, we will give them the bayonet," replied Jackson, as his thin lips closed like a vice. Inspired with renewed confidence, Bee galloped back to the ravine where his officers were trying to reform their broken companies. Pointing with his sword to the line on the heights above, he cried, "Look! There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians!" Bee died that day, but his words will live forever. From that hour, Thomas Jonathan Jackson was universally known as Stonewall Jackson. Beauregard and Johnston were now on the ground. The former took personal command of the troops, while the latter rode back to the headquarters at the Lewis house to hurry up reinforcements. It was now about 2:00. General McDowell, who was present, in direct command of the Union forces, decided to complete the victory by carrying the Confederate position on the Henry House Hill. He had allowed Burnside to withdraw his brigade, which was exhausted from the morning's work, but he had in hand for the attack the brigades of Porter, Wilcox, Sherman, and Franklin, a squadron of regular cavalry, and 4 batteries of artillery, about 10,000 men. Tyler, with Keyes' brigade of his division, after a feeble demonstration against the Confederate right, had recrossed Young's Branch, and took no further part in the battle. Schenck's brigade and Tyler's artillery were still on the other side of Bull Run. Howard's brigade had not yet come up. The Confederate force on the hill comprised about 6,500 infantry, Stewart's squadron of cavalry, and 13 pieces of artillery. After the withdrawal of the Confederates from their first position on Matthews Hill, McDowell placed 2 fine regular batteries of Ricketts and Griffin on a hill near the Dogan House, in the angle between the turnpike and the Sudley road. From this position they swept the summit of the Henry Hill with a destructive fire. Knowing the moral support which artillery always gives to infantry, before assaulting the new Confederate position, McDowell ordered Major Berry, his chief of artillery, to send forward these 2 batteries to a position beyond and to the south of the Henry House. It was a strange procedure to expose these valuable batteries without any infantry support to a close musketry fire, which of course they could not return. Ricketts and Griffin were amazed to receive such an order, but they promptly obeyed, and went into battery near the Henry House, within musket shot of the woods south of it. Here the batteries were charged by Stewart's cavalry stationed on the left of the Confederate line, and the Zouave regiment, which had been assigned as a support, at once gave way. While Colonel Wilcox was endeavoring to rally the Zouaves, the 33rd Virginia suddenly appeared from the woods at the south, and advanced toward the batteries. At this early date the uniforms in the two armies were very much alike, and from the direction of the advance Major Barry thought that this was a Federal regiment sent to their support. He therefore ordered Griffin to withhold his fire. A moment later the doubtful regiment proved its identity by a deadly volley delivered at a range of 70 yards. Every gunner was shot down, several officers fell killed or wounded, and the batteries were rendered useless for the rest of the day. Griffin managed to drag off 3 of his guns, but Ricketts was badly wounded and captured. Although somewhat discouraged by this reverse, McDowell had no idea of giving up the fight. The Federals crossed the valley at Young's Branch, mounted the northern slopes of the hill, and gained the plateau beyond the Henry House. Here the fighting became fierce. The batteries were taken and retaken. The hill at times was covered with the Federal regiments. The enemy more than once was driven back into the woods which bordered the plateau on the south and east, and into which the Federal troops could not venture to follow. For more than an hour the battle raged backward and forward across the plateau, without any material change in the situation. About 3 o'clock Howard came up, but too late to effect the result. Then the Confederates received reinforcements which turned the day in their favor. Early's brigade came up from the lower fords. Kirby Smith's brigade of Johnston's army reached Manassas by rail from the valley, and marched at once to the field. These fresh troops were placed far out on the Confederate left, thus enveloping the right flank of the Federals. As Smith led in his troops, he was severely wounded, and had to turn over the command to Elzey. Beauregard now ordered an advance all along the line, and the effect was decisive. The Union soldiers, without any show of panic, simply broke ranks and started home, retiring for the most part over the roads by which they had come. The retreat was covered by Sykes' battalion of infantry and Palmer's squadron of cavalry, both of the regular army. By 6 o'clock there was not a Union soldier but the dead, the wounded, and the captives on the south side of Bull Run, says Steele. No effective pursuit was made by the Confederates. Never did an enemy make a cleaner escape out of such an exposed position after such an utter rout, says General Alexander. Early in the afternoon President Davis arrived at Manassas by rail from Richmond. Mounting a horse, he rode to the field. To the long procession of stragglers retiring from the battlefield, he cried, "I am President Davis. Follow me back to the field." Not far off, Stonewall Jackson was having a wound in his hand dressed by a surgeon. Hearing the words of Davis, he shouted, "We have whipped them! They ran like sheep. Give me 5,000 fresh men, and I will be in Washington City tomorrow morning." In fact, Jackson seems to have been the only man to grasp the situation, and realize the great opportunity before them. The President and his 2 generals spent the rest of the afternoon in riding over the field. Although it was not sunset until after 7, and there was a nearly full moon, no serious pursuit was attempted. For this failure to follow up their success the Confederate generals have presented many excuses. "Our army," says General Johnston, "was more disorganized by victory than that of the United States by defeat." McDowell intended to make a stand at Centreville, but the men could not be stopped there, and the Federal army retired within the defenses of Washington. The losses at Manassas, which the Federals call the Battle of Bull Run, were as follows: Federals killed 460, Confederates 387, Federals wounded 1,124, Confederates 1,582, Federals missing 1,312, Confederates 13. The total losses for Federals 2,896, and for the Confederates 1,982. Estimated on the basis of the Confederate losses, probably 750 of the Union prisoners were wounded, which would make the total Federal loss in killed and wounded over 2,300, or approximately 12% of the number actually engaged. The Confederate loss was not quite so large, about 11%. These figures show hard fighting. On the Federal side, Hunter and Heintzelman were wounded, Wilcox wounded and captured. On the Confederate side, Bee and Bartow were killed, Jackson and Kirby Smith wounded. In the organization of its First Army, the Confederacy displayed more ability than the government of Washington. Mr. Davis was a graduate of West Point and had served 7 years in the regular army. He had commanded a volunteer regiment in the Mexican War, and had later been Secretary of War. He was acquainted personally or officially with most of the higher officers of the old army, and his selections for command were generally good. He had the professional soldier's horror of putting troops in charge of men who knew nothing of the business of war. No citizen soldier was given a high command until he had demonstrated his fitness. He did not make the mistake of Mr. Lincoln, with his lack of military experience, and appoint to important commands such men as Banks and Butler. The Union army of 35,000 men was the largest ever assembled on this continent, yet it was not organized into higher units than regiments until just before it left Washington. McDowell's halt of 2 days at Centreville, necessitated by the disorganized state of his army, was fatal. It gave time for the transfer from the valley of Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah, which decided the battle on Sunday afternoon. The strategy of the Federal commander has been approved by many writers. For example, General Sherman says, "It is now generally admitted that it was one of the best planned battles of the war, but one of the worst fought." Colonel Henderson also writes, "The turning movement by Sudley Springs was a skillful maneuver, and completely surprised both Johnston and Beauregard. It was undoubtedly risky, but it was far less dangerous than a direct attack on the strong position along Bull Run." These opinions seem to be based upon an erroneous impression of the formidable strength of the Confederate position, and it is therefore somewhat difficult to agree entirely with these eminent authorities. Colonel Henderson writes, "The Confederates were strongly posted. Even with regular troops, a direct attack on a single point of passage would have been difficult." Mr. Rope says that Bull Run "presented a formidable obstacle for such raw troops as those which constituted the United States forces." On the other hand, Captain, afterwards General, Alexander of the Confederate army, who was present at the battle, says, "Our army was weak and badly posted, and could not have withstood a vigorous attack by the force in front of us. Both of our flanks were in the air, and Bull Run could be crossed by infantry in many places. Our center was a large salient whose lines the enemy could enfilade. The ground on their side was commanding and afforded close approach under excellent cover. On our side it was low and gently rising to the rear, giving no cover whatever, except of the woods." In McDowell's report he states that he could not make the attack earlier than he did. "I wished to go to Centreville the second day," he writes, "but I was told that it was impossible for the men to march further. They had only come from Vienna, about 6 miles, and it was not more than 6½ miles further to Centreville, in all a march of 12½ miles. But the men were foot weary." Nevertheless, in the face of this experience of only 2 days before, McDowell laid his plans for 5 of his 8 brigades to make a night march of 9 or 10 miles, by a circuitous route which would take them dangerously far from his other forces. In other words, he took the risk of having his army split in two by a formidable obstacle. The success of his project depended upon his rolling up the left flank of the enemy, and clearing the path for his own forces to unite by way of the Stone Bridge. It further involved the hazard of forming his line of battle parallel to the Warrenton Pike, his line of retreat; or with his back to the stream, or with his face to the rear. In fact, McDowell deliberately took the risk of leaving his small rear guard to maintain his line of communications, and cut loose from his base for the purpose of turning the enemy's left. His main body was further from Centreville than was the Confederate right, and he did not dare to call on his reserves for reinforcements. Unless he won a decisive victory his position would be untenable, and he would be forced to withdraw across the stream. But General Sherman is quite right in saying that the battle was not well fought. From every tactical point of view the attack was badly made. Instead of setting up his headquarters somewhere in the rear and directing the operations as a whole, McDowell was at the very front, and scarcely exercised any influence on the action. As so often happened in the battles of the Civil War, regiments and brigades went into the battle without any sort of order or concert of action. The assaults were all straight to the front. There was no effort to make a flank attack. Although the stone bridge was open, McDowell did not summon his reserves from Centreville, only 4 miles away. He did not call Schenck's brigade, and the batteries with it, across the run. He did not order Burnside back into action. He allowed Keyes to lie idle under cover of Young's branch throughout the afternoon. General Johnston says, "If the tactics of the Federals had been equal to their strategy, we should have been beaten." And General Alexander writes, "The Federal tactics were poor and timid. There was lack of concert and combined power." Colonel Henderson, after paying a tribute to the accuracy of the fire, the fine discipline and staunch endurance of the Federal gunners, who were all old soldiers, says: "The infantry, on the other hand, was not well handled. The attack was purely frontal. No attempt was made to turn the Confederate flanks, although the stone bridge was now open, and Johnston's line might easily have been taken in reverse. Nor does it appear that the cavalry was employed to ascertain where the flanks rested. Moreover, instead of massing the troops for a determined onslaught, driven home by sheer weight of numbers, the attack was made by successive brigades, those in rear waiting till those in front had been defeated; and in the same manner the brigades attacked by successive regiments. Such tactics were inexcusable." Mr. Rope states that the work of Colonel Henderson was not seen by him until his own book was in press, but he met this criticism in advance by the following explanation of McDowell's course: "He did not undertake to coordinate the movements of his divisions and brigades, as he doubtless would have liked to do, because he thought it very doubtful if he could succeed in such an undertaking with raw troops and inexperienced generals, and because, moreover, it would have taken precious time to make the attempt." Later Mr. Rope states: "McDowell could not, with the number of troops at his immediate disposal, turn his adversary's position. He had not a sufficient superiority in force." As bearing on this point, it may be stated that, at the period of the battle on the Henry Hill, Henderson estimates that the Federals had 16,000 infantry available, while both Ropes and Alexander state that McDowell had under his immediate control not much more than 9,000 men, allowing for casualties and stragglers, and taking into account the absence from the firing line of the 4 brigades of Howard, Burnside, Keyes, and Schenck. All the authorities agree that Beauregard was holding the hill with about 6,500 men; but the chances were rather in his favor, as he was standing on the defensive, and the Federal troops, after marching and fighting for 12 hours, were nearly exhausted. The Federal army should have contained a brigade of cavalry, but it had only 7 little troops, and they were mostly split up into small details. The Confederates had 1,800 horsemen, but they were split up in the same manner. With the exception of Stewart's charge on the Zouaves, the cavalry played a very insignificant role in the battle. Beauregard's handling of his troops was equally bad, but fortunately for the Confederacy he had an able associate in Johnston, who hurried up reinforcements at the critical moment, in time to save the day. Out of McDowell's army of 35,000 men, only 18,500 crossed the run; and of these the brigades of Burnside and Keyes took little part in the action. Beauregard had about 32,000 men on the field, but he put only 18,000 into the battle. In very few actions of the Civil War were the numbers engaged so nearly equal, but the Confederates had the advantage of acting throughout on the defensive. Only 2 officers handled their men well: Sherman on the Union side, and Jackson on the Confederate. It was the latter's wise choice of a position on the further edge of the open plateau, and McDowell's failure to take it in flank, which enabled the Confederates to hold out for 4 hours against superior numbers, and made their victory possible. In the opinion of Colonel Henderson, the position chosen by Jackson was the strongest that could be found, a position from which the view is limited, well in the rear of a crest line. The brow of the hill which looks down upon Yonge's Branch gave an extended view and a wide field of fire upon the advancing Federals, but both flanks would have been exposed. Later, at the battle of Chattanooga, we shall see the dangers of such a position, where the defenders could see the hosts of the enemy preparing for the assault. The catastrophe of Manassas may be termed one of those unavoidable accidents that so frequently occur in war. But for a few days the North seemed dazed. Stocks went down and money went up. Then stern resolve took the place of despair. To the President's call for volunteers there was a magnificent response. The men enlisted with a spirit that has never been surpassed. To the South, on the other hand, Manassas was a Pyrrhic victory. It gave their people a very unwarranted opinion of the superior fighting qualities of their troops. To many the war seemed to be over. Volunteering stopped, and even in South Carolina it proved to be impossible to raise sufficient troops to garrison the seacoast defenses. The government indulged in vain hopes of foreign intervention. Few were wise enough, like General Johnston, to realize that the Southern victory was not due to any degree to lack of prowess in their assailants. Many of the officers engaged in this first great battle of the war subsequently attained high rank in the two services. On the Union side, Sherman, Burnside, McDowell, Keyes, Heintzelman, Franklin, Porter, and Howard became army or corps commanders. On the Confederate side, Johnston and Beauregard became full generals, and Jackson, Longstreet, Ewell, Early, and Holmes, lieutenant generals. End of Chapter 2. 4. April 1862. Shiloh. Note: a map of the field of Shiloh can be found on page 63. The 1st of April, 1862, General Grant's command, now called the Army of the Tennessee, was encamped on the west bank of the Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing, a point about 100 miles south of Fort Henry, and 20 miles north of Corinth, where Johnston was assembling his army. Grant's headquarters were at Savannah, a small town about 9 miles further down on the other, east bank of the river. A few weeks prior to this date, Grant had been temporarily suspended, owing to a misunderstanding with Halleck, and the site of the camp was selected by C.F. Smith, who was at first in charge of the expedition. But that excellent officer met early in March with a serious accident, from the effects of which he never recovered. The ground upon which the camp stood, and upon which the battle of Shiloh was fought, was an irregular triangle, with sides 3 or 4 miles long, bounded on the north and west by Snake Creek and its tributary, Owl Creek; on the east by the Tennessee; on the south by Lick Creek and its branch Locust Grove Creek, a small brook in quite a deep ravine. At that time all of these streams were more or less flooded. The highest ground, about 200 feet above the river, was a ridge lying north of Locust Grove Creek, and from this point the land sloped gradually to the level of the camps, 100 feet below. The ground, uneven and thickly wooded, was mostly impassable for cavalry, although there were several clearings of from 20 to 80 acres. A number of small roads intersected the field, and on one of these, running out toward Corinth, near the west of the position, was a rude meeting house built of logs and known as Shiloh Church, which gave the name to the battle. The greater part of the army was arranged across the base, or open front, of the triangle between Owl and Lick Creeks, which protected its two flanks. This open front was the only quarter in which the army was exposed to assault. At a later period of the war this line would have been entrenched, and the whole position made impregnable. The right of the line, near the crossing of Owl Creek by the Purdy Road, was held by Sherman, with Prentiss next to him on the left. On Sherman's left and rear was McClernand, while Stewart's brigade of Sherman's division held the extreme left, resting upon Lick Creek. From a mile to a mile and a half in the rear, stretching from a point just above the landing nearly across to Snake Creek, were the divisions of Hurlbut and C.F. Smith, the latter now under the command of William Wallace, owing to Smith's injury. The division of Lew Wallace was 5 miles down the river at Crump's Landing, whence a road runs west to Purdy. Another road, parallel with the river, connected Wallace with the Union position by a bridge lately built over Snake Creek. From Pittsburgh Landing 2 roads led direct to Corinth, only 20 miles away, where it was known that Johnston was assembling an army, estimated at from 50 to 80,000 men. But, as above stated, no works of any kind were thrown up on the exposed side of the Federal position. Nor was there arranged any line of defense or plan of action in case of attack. Furthermore, there was no possibility of retreat from the position. No bridge could be thrown across the Tennessee, which at the time was very high, overflowing its banks. In the rear were deep and muddy creeks which were practically impassable. The whole arrangement was manifestly faulty, and indicates great carelessness on the part of General Grant. His headquarters were 9 miles away, and all the well-known maxims of war applicable to such a situation were unheeded by him. Probably there never was an army encamped in the heart of a hostile country with so little regard to the manifest risks which are inseparable from such a position. For this state of affairs Halleck was largely responsible. It was by his permission and approval that Grant, with over 40,000 men, was encamped at Pittsburgh Landing in such an exposed position. But Grant, who was on the ground, cannot escape his share of the responsibility. Halleck had, indeed, ordered Buell to direct his march on Savannah, but in his correspondence he never once intimated to Buell that Grant's army was in peril until it was joined by the troops coming from Nashville. In reality, that danger was imminent. As we have seen, the army under the command of Johnston had retired from Nashville to Murfreesboro. Thence it marched south over very bad roads to Decatur, in Alabama. Here, about the middle of March, the Tennessee River was crossed, and the march resumed in a westerly direction, the head of the column reaching Corinth and Mississippi about the 18th. Johnston had with him some 20,000 men, and he was almost immediately joined by General Bragg, with about 10,000 troops from Pensacola and New Orleans. To this point also Beauregard, his able second in command, directed the forces of Polk, who, since the evacuation of Columbus, had been at Humboldt and Jackson. On the 29th of March, Johnston formally assumed the command of these forces, to which he gave the name of the Army of the Mississippi. Bragg was made chief of staff, and Beauregard was designated as second in command. The army was divided into 3 corps, under the command of Polk, Bragg, and Hardee. There was also a reserve division of infantry, under Breckinridge, lately the Vice President of the United States. The army numbered nearly 40,000 men, of whom 35,000 were infantry, and the rest cavalry and artillery. There were about 100 guns. The Confederate forces were ably commanded. Johnston was generally considered to be one of the finest officers in the service. Bragg, who subsequently commanded the army, stood very high as an organizer and disciplinarian, and was a good general, although not a successful strategist. Breckinridge, although a civilian, was a gallant and efficient officer. Johnston, who was well informed regarding the position of the Federals, was anxious to strike Grant before Buell could arrive, but it was impossible to complete the organization of his new army before the 1st of April. Orders for the advance was finally issued on the 3rd. Then the roads were found so bad, and the weather was so rainy, it was impossible to cover the short distance of 20 miles under 3 days, so that the army did not get within striking distance until Saturday afternoon, the 5th of April. Beauregard felt certain that Buell's army must have joined Grant by this time, and advised that the plan be given up, but to this Johnston would not consent. Accordingly the orders were issued to attack the enemy at daybreak on Sunday the 6th. The Federal forces under General Grant comprised 6 divisions of infantry, and numbered on paper nearly 45,000 men, of whom about 3,000 were cavalry. There were over 20 batteries, more than 100 guns. All of the division generals were men of unquestioned bravery and perfectly equal to their tasks. Sherman subsequently rose to the command of this army. In the meantime, the Army of the Ohio, under General Buell, was slowly marching across the country from Nashville, on the Cumberland, to Savannah, on the Tennessee. His force consisted of 5 divisions, under Thomas, McCook, Nelson, Crittenden, and Wood, and numbered about 37,000 men, with a full complement of artillery and some cavalry. The army marched steadily, but without haste, covering about 15 miles a day. At Duck River it was found that the bridge had been burned by the enemy, and this caused a delay of nearly 2 weeks. The movement was not pressed because Buell had no intimation from either Halleck or Grant that the army at Pittsburg Landing was in any danger of attack. In fact, to use Buell's own words, he understood that he was "not to succor General Grant's army, but to form a junction with it for an ulterior offensive campaign." Nelson, who was in the lead, arrived at Savannah with his division on Saturday, 5th of April, about noon, and with one of his brigade commanders, Ammen, saw Grant that same afternoon. Ammen suggested that the division should cross the river at once and join the army encamped at Pittsburg Landing, but Grant declined the offer, remarking that there would be no battle there, and that they would have to go to Corinth. The same day Grant wrote to Halleck that he had "scarcely the faintest idea" that an attack would be made upon him, but that he should be prepared if it took place. Such blind confidence is hard to explain, when he thought that Johnston had at Corinth, on his own estimate, not far from 80,000 men. Sherman, who appears to have been in command when Grant was not at the camp, shared in full the confidence of his chief. On the 5th he wrote Grant, "I do not apprehend anything like an attack on our position." Both Sherman and Prentiss, however, sent out small parties to reconnoiter. Several bodies of the enemy were encountered on Saturday, and on Sunday morning at 3 o'clock, Prentiss dispatched an entire brigade to ascertain the extent of the Confederate forces. About 6 o'clock these troops came in contact with the enemy's first line, under Hardee, and were driven back with loss. The original Confederate order was to attack at 3 o'clock on the morning of Saturday the 5th, but the troops were not in position until late that afternoon. All day Friday they had advanced over muddy roads, hindered by a pelting rain. After midnight a violent storm broke upon them, as they stood under arms in the pitch darkness, with no shelter but the trees. This was followed by clearing weather, and the sun set on Saturday evening in a cloudless sky. Sunday morning broke upon a scene so fair that it left its memory on thousands of hearts. The sky was clear overhead, the air fresh; and when the sun rose in full splendor, the advancing host passed the word from lip to lip that it was "the son of Austerlitz." The Confederates advanced to the attack in 3 parallel lines, under the command of Hardee, Bragg, and Polk. With the reserve of Breckinridge they numbered 39,630 men, including 4,300 cavalry. The first gun was fired at 5:14, as General Johnston was taking coffee with his staff. They at once mounted and galloped to the front. 2 hours later the Confederate artillery opened fire, and Johnston's army advanced with a rush, confident of victory. The Union troops, suddenly alive to the fact that they were attacked in great force, hardly had time to seize their muskets and fall in before the first Confederate line was upon them. Not expecting any attack, and not being in order of battle, for the first few hours they were at the mercy of their antagonists. The resistance they offered was therefore of a fragmentary and disconnected character; each body of troops making the best defense it could, often isolated from the other bodies of troops in its vicinity, and therefore exposed to having its flanks turned by the well supported lines of the Confederate army. To make matters worse, for several hours there was no commanding general on the field, and each division commander was thrown upon his own resources, with such assistance as he could get from his nearest neighbor. The first shock fell upon the 2 divisions of Sherman and Prentiss, which were almost entirely composed of raw troops, and they soon gave way, but for the most part fell back to new positions. This gave time for the divisions of McClernand, Hurlbut, and Wallace to get under arms and form in order of battle. Sherman's division naturally retired on that of McClernand, and Hurlbut sent 1 brigade to their assistance. These troops fought gallantly and stubbornly during the whole day, without the slightest aid from the center, from which they were separated by a wide gap. Falling back from one position to another, at the close of the day they covered the bridge over Snake Creek, by which Lew Wallace was expected to arrive. In his report, McClernand states that this was the 8th position he had occupied during the battle. Prentiss's division, also composed of raw troops, fell back upon the 2 remaining brigades of Hurlbut, and William Wallace brought up his division to their assistance. About 10 o'clock these three bodies of troops, constituting the center of the army, took up a very strong position, which the Confederates called the Hornets' Nest. This was located near the center of the Union line, about half way between the church and the river. It was a wooded area with dense undergrowth, and was well suited for defense. Here they held out for 5 or 6 hours against the repeated assaults of the enemy, whom they again and again beat back with severe loss. It was in directing one of these assaults, about 2:30, that General Johnston was killed. He was struck by a rifle ball which cut an artery in the leg. If a tourniquet had been applied, the wound need not have been fatal. But Johnston, absorbed in his work, paid no attention to it, and suddenly fell dead from loss of blood. His death was a greater misfortune to the South than the loss of the battle. Finally, after 4 o'clock, Bragg abandoned these costly frontal attacks, and advanced beyond the Federal position. Hurlbut, finding himself flanked, retired to the Landing. This exposed Prentiss's left, and forced him to change front. Soon afterwards, about 5 o'clock, the two divisions of Prentiss and Wallace were attacked by the Confederate corps of Polk and Hardee, in front and on both flanks. In trying to withdraw his command, Wallace was killed, and between 5 and half past 5 o'clock Prentiss was forced to surrender, with about 2,200 men. This ended the resistance of the Federal center. The isolated brigade of Stewart on the extreme left maintained its position until after 3 o'clock, and then succeeded in retiring to the Landing, having lost about half its men. Late in the afternoon there were from 5,000 to 15,000 fugitives crowded under the high bluff near the Landing. Efforts were made from time to time to rally them, but they were thoroughly demoralized, and would not budge from their shelter. General Grant was taking an early breakfast at Savannah when he heard the sound of heavy firing at the Landing. He ordered Nelson to march his division up the river to a point opposite the Landing, ready to be ferried over. Then he started up the river himself in a steamer, stopping at Crump's Landing to direct Lew Wallace to be ready to march on receipt of orders. Finding on his arrival that the attack was very serious, he sent a staff officer to order Wallace to march at once. He then rode to the battlefield, saw Sherman about 10 o'clock, and afterwards Prentiss at the Hornets' Nest, which he ordered him to maintain at all hazards. Realizing then how dangerous the situation was, at noon he dispatched an urgent note to Buell, asking him to get his troops on the field at once. The final Federal position of the day was on a line running from just above the Landing to the bridge across Snake Creek. The left of this position was covered by a ravine partly overflowed with backwater. Here a force of some 4,000 men was collected, and a battery of 20 pieces was planted on the bluffs by Colonel Webster of Grant's staff, just as 3 Confederate brigades were advancing to the attack. These guns opened upon them, while at the same time 2 of the Union gunboats enfiladed the Confederate lines. The Confederates, loath to abandon the contest, in which victory seemed almost within their grasp, rushed down into the ravine and climbed the steep slope on the further side. Here they received the terrible fire of the battery and the destructive volleys of the Union infantry. Again and again they attempted to reach the crest, but were as often forced to retire. The sun was fast disappearing, and little time was left to finish the work of the day. Just as night set in, Beauregard, who was now in supreme command, ordered the troops to withdraw. For this he has been severely criticized, but nothing was to be gained that afternoon by prolonging the action. In his review of the battle, General Buell, speaking of the final Confederate assault, says: "The attack was poorly organized, but it was not repulsed until Ammen, of Nelson's division, arrived. Had the attack been made before Nelson could arrive, it would have succeeded beyond all question. As a matter of fact, Ammen's brigade was ferried across the river just in time to see the end. It had 2 men killed and 1 wounded. The arrival of Nelson, therefore, did not affect the result in the smallest degree." Buell's statement is also directly contradicted by Beauregard's article on the battle. He writes: "After the capture of General Prentiss, no serious effort was made to press the victory by the corps commanders. In fact, the troops had got out of the hands of the corps, divisional and brigade commanders. and, for the most part, moreover, at the front, were out of ammunition. Several most gallant uncombined efforts were made to reach and carry the Federal battery, but in every instance the effort failed. He adds that, really, the attack had ceased at every point. Before he issued orders at 6 o'clock to suspend hostilities and withdraw the troops from under fire. Professor Fiske considers General Buell's article as one of the most masterly pieces of military criticism in any language. But Buell was so biased by his jealousy and hatred of General Grant that his statements cannot be accepted without many qualifications. Mr. Ropes also shows his animosity to General Grant, in his declaration that the final attack would probably have succeeded but for the arrival of Buell's fresh and well-disciplined troops. He says that, if the landing had been seized and occupied by the Confederates, they could easily have prevented Nelson's division from crossing, and what was left of Grant's army might have been forced to surrender. But, says General Beauregard, in every instance the effort failed. Nelson's division was delayed in reaching the field through the neglect of Grant to provide steamers to transport the troops from Savannah. They were forced to march up the east side of the river through a swamp in which the artillery had to be abandoned. The division of Lew Wallace of Grant's army took the wrong road in the morning and did not arrive until after dark. Probably not more than 12,000 men of the Army of the Tennessee were with the cutters that night. It is evident from all the accounts, Grant's included, that the battle of Sunday was fought by the Union army without any directing head, says Mr. Ropes. Fortunate was it for the Union cause that 5 such gallant and capable division commanders were on the field. They did all that could be done in the circumstances in which they were placed. But it cannot be supposed that their efforts would not have been better employed, and therefore more successful, had they found in Grant a general who was capable of assuming the entire control and direction of a great battle. Grant, however, was not a general of this sort. He had neither the ability nor the experience for such a task. The battle of Sunday was fought by the Confederates with the greatest energy and courage, but it failed of final success because of tactical errors. Their plan was to turn the Union left so as to cut the Federals off from the landing, and surround them in the angle of Owl Creek, in which event they hoped to ensure a surrender. But in the heat of the conflict this excellent plan was lost sight of, and their strength was wasted for hours in a vain effort to take the Hornets' Nest by a frontal attack. With all his great abilities, it must be admitted that Johnston did not attempt on this day to fill the role of an army commander. He left the general control of the action to Beauregard, and confined himself to directing the assault on the Union center, where he lost his life. During the night the remainder of Nelson's division arrived, also that of Crittenden, and early in the morning McCook came up. These 3 divisions of Buell's army, numbering about 20,000 men, were placed on the left of the Union line. The right was held by the divisions of Hurlbut and McClernand, which still preserved their organization, and the 5,000 fresh troops of Lew Wallace. The divisions of Sherman and William Wallace were broken up, but many of the men were in line for the second day's battle. Grant and Buell determined to assume the offensive as early as possible. Buell took the personal direction of his own troops and handled them in masterly fashion. The defeat of the Confederates in the battle of the second day was inevitable. They could put only 20,000 men in line, while the Federals had 25,000 fresh troops, besides at least 10,000 who had taken part in the action of Sunday. As Professor Fiske remarks, the Civil War proved that in fighting quality there was little to choose between the soldiers of the North and the South, so that, under similar conditions, victory always took the side of the heaviest battalions. The Confederates held practically the same line to the north of Shiloh Church which had been occupied the previous day by the Union camp. Bragg was on the extreme left, with Polk and Breckinridge next, and finally Hardee on the extreme right next to the river. Beauregard handled his troops bravely and skillfully, and was ably seconded by his corps commanders. No final or critical stand was made anywhere, and by 4 o'clock the Confederate army had fallen back beyond Shiloh Church. Here General Grant stopped the Federal advance. Considering the numbers engaged, the losses on both sides had been very heavy. Federals killed, 1,754; Confederates, 1,728. Wounded, Federals, 8,408; Confederates, 8,012. Federals missing, 2,885; Confederates, 959. Therefore the total amount of losses for the Federals was 13,047, and 10,699 for the Confederates. The Federal casualties amounted to over 24%, and the Confederates to more than 26%, a larger percentage than in any battle of the Civil War except Chickamauga. In his Memoirs, Grant says: "Shiloh was the severest battle fought at the West during the war. I saw an open field, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground." For many years the battle of Shiloh was a subject of bitter controversy in the North. "Probably no single battle of the war," says General Sherman, "gave rise to such wild and damaging reports. It was publicly asserted at the North that our army was taken completely by surprise; that the rebels caught us in our tents, bayoneted the men in their beds; that General Grant was drunk; that Buell's opportune arrival saved the Army of the Tennessee from utter annihilation," etc. These reports were quite generally believed, and were in a measure sustained by the published articles of Buell, Nelson, and others. Even Mr. Ropes, who is generally very fair in his criticisms, has many severe comments to make on the subject of General Grant. But after the lapse of 60 years it may now be possible to take a less prejudiced view of the events and incidents of the battle. The falsity of some of the charges mentioned by General Sherman will be apparent from the above narrative, but others may be considered here in somewhat greater detail. General Sherman says: "We did not fortify our camps against an attack, because we had no orders to do so, and because such a course would have made our raw men timid. At a later period of the war we could have rendered this position impregnable in one night, but at this time we did not do it." General Grant writes: "The criticism has often been made that the Union troops should have been entrenched at Shiloh. Up to that time the pick and spade had been but little resorted to at the West. I had, however, taken this subject under consideration soon after reassuming command in the field, and, as already stated, my only military engineer reported unfavorably. Besides this, the troops with me, officers and men, needed discipline and drill more than they did experience with the pick, shovel, and axe. Under all these circumstances I concluded that drill and discipline were worth more to our men than fortifications." On this point it may be remarked that even so good a soldier as Robert E. Lee did not employ field entrenchments at Antietam 6 months later, in the autumn of this same year. It is therefore hardly fair to condemn Grant and his able division commanders for not having taken such a precaution at this early period of the Civil War. Grant has also been criticized for maintaining his headquarters at Savannah, 9 miles from the camp. He states that it was his intention to move to Pittsburgh, but Buell was expected daily and would come in at Savannah. He therefore remained at that point a few days longer than he otherwise would have done in order to meet Buell on his arrival. The relations between Grant and Buell had never been very cordial, and for this reason Grant wished to show his rival every consideration. Buell, however, was less courteous. Although he reached Savannah on Saturday night, he did not make his presence known to Grant, and they did not meet until 1 o'clock the following day. On Friday night, the 4th of April, when returning from the front, where firing had been heard, Grant was badly injured by a fall of his horse. In the darkness, with the rain pouring down in torrents on the way back to the boat, the horse fell, with Grant's leg under its body. Only the softness of the ground saved the general from a very severe injury. As it was, his boot had to be cut off, and for several days he was unable to walk except with crutches. It is well known that Grant, on account of his habits, had been somewhat under a cloud when he left the regular army. On the first day of the battle he was under a terrible physical and mental strain, and it would not be strange if he resorted to stimulants, but there is nothing in any of the reports of the battle to show that he was not in the full possession of his faculties. In his memoirs General Grant denies emphatically the statement so often made, that his troops were badly beaten on the first day of Shiloh. He says, "There was, in fact, no hour during the day when I doubted the eventual defeat of the enemy." This statement is borne out by the account of Whitelaw Reid, who has pictured Grant at the moment of the last Confederate attack. He sat his horse, quiet, thoughtful, almost stolid. "Does not the prospect begin to look gloomy?" some one asked. "Not at all," was the quiet reply. "They cannot force our lines around these batteries to night. To morrow we shall attack them with fresh troops, and drive them, of course." It is a principle often illustrated in war that when two armies have fought until their strength is well nigh spent, the one that can soonest summon its jaded energies to a final assault is almost sure to win. Grant was a very brave, resolute, obstinate man, and a hard fighter. Whatever might be the chances, he was determined to hold out to the last. There is little doubt, therefore, that even without the arrival of Buell, he would have resumed the battle the next morning with the fresh troops of Lew Wallace, and what was left of his other divisions. He would have had about 17,000 men in line, and the Confederate army was reduced to not more than 20,000 troops, all of whom were in organizations which had been greatly shattered by the casualties of the battle of Sunday, as well as weakened by the loss of many valuable officers. There was at least an even chance of winning. As Grant tersely remarks, "The victory was not to either party until the battle was over." Grant admits that an immediate pursuit of the enemy after the battle must have resulted in the capture of a considerable number of prisoners and probably some guns. "I wanted to pursue," he says, "but had not the heart to order the men who had fought desperately for 2 days, lying in the mud and rain whenever not fighting, and I did not feel disposed positively to order Buell, or any part of his command, to pursue. Although the senior in rank at the time, I had been so only a few weeks. I did not meet Buell in person until too late to get troops ready and pursue with effect." Grant was a very shy, modest, unassuming man, and in view of the somewhat strained relations between Buell and himself, it is easy to understand his attitude. But General Buell, as Grant himself states, was a brave, intelligent officer, with much professional pride and ambition, and Buell himself should not only have proposed, but even insisted upon, taking up the pursuit with his fresh troops who had not been engaged in the battle. That he did not do so was doubtless due to the jealousy of Grant, which he showed on this and on many later occasions. He was far more to blame than Grant for not securing the full fruits of the victory. On this same subject General Buell writes, "I make no attempt to excuse myself or blame others, when I say that General Grant's troops, the lowest individual among them not more than the commander himself, appear to have thought that the object of the battle was sufficiently accomplished when they were reinstated in their camps, and that in some way that idea obstructed the reorganization of my line until a further advance that day became impracticable." And Professor Fiske says, "I suspect that the true explanation, after all, may be that our peace-loving people had not yet come to realize what a terrible affair war is, when truly effective, and especially when waged against our own kin. We were satisfied with thwarting the hostile enemy, and did not appreciate the need for terminating its existence." More than any battle of modern times Shiloh resembled the conflicts of the Middle Ages, in which knight fought against knight in the general mêlée. An attempt to recount in detail all the incidents of the day would be both tedious and unprofitable. It was like a gigantic kaleidoscope in which objects were constantly shifting, but never repeated in symmetrical patterns. For this confusion there were 2 reasons principally. First, the Confederate attack was made in very unusual tactical formation. Instead of the 3 corps commanders, Hardee, Polk, and Bragg, taking charge respectively of the left, center, and right, as was arranged later in the day, Beauregard ordered that the 3 corps should advance in line, one behind the other. Hardee's corps, with a brigade from Bragg's, was to constitute the first line, the remainder of Bragg's corps the second line, and Polk's corps, with Breckinridge's division, the third. Second, the camps in which the Federals were taken by surprise were established to suit the convenience of the several commanders, and without any pretense of system. The army was not in the least prepared to receive an attack. It was not even in order of battle. The resistance, therefore, which it offered to the Confederate attack was necessarily of a fragmentary and disconnected character; each body of troops making the best defense it could, often isolated from the other bodies of troops in its vicinity. The course which the battle took was therefore what might have been expected under such conditions. Of all the battles of the Civil War, that of Shiloh, says Major Steele, is the hardest problem for the military student, the most difficult in which to apportion the credit and the blame. "It is not an easy task," writes Mr. Ropes, "to follow the movements of General Halleck's mind during the 10 days which succeeded the fall of Fort Donelson. It is certain, however, that he did not do what McClellan expected of him, and that was to occupy Nashville at once. He did little except to bombard the government with applications to be given the chief command in the West. 'Give it to me,' he wrote on the 19th February, 'and I will split secession in twain in 1 month.' Finally, on the 11th of March, 1862, in anticipation of the forward movement in the East, McClellan was relieved of the general command of the armies, and Halleck's wish was granted. His department comprised all of Kentucky and Tennessee, and the army of General Buell was placed under him. Although it was a great advantage to the Union cause to have all the forces in this territory under one general, the appointment of Halleck was a mistake. He had been educated at West Point, but most of his life had been passed out of the army, and he had little natural aptitude for military affairs. He was, moreover, careless, indolent, and inexact to a high degree. Before being placed in command, Halleck did nothing until about the 1st of March, when he sent C. F. Smith on a sort of steamboat raid up the Tennessee. This led to the selection of Pittsburg Landing as a site for the camp of Grant's army. As soon as Halleck was appointed to the supreme command, he ordered Buell to march on Savannah. This was practically the only act of Halleck's in the campaign which was of value. It brought Buell's army to Shiloh in time to turn a Union reverse into a victory, possibly in time to save Grant's army from capture. It is impossible to say anything in commendation of the tactics employed at Shiloh on either side. Neither of the hostile armies on that day was really commanded. The two armies, in fact, fought without any control, and to this fact nearly all the mistakes can be charged. Neither Grant nor Johnston established headquarters from which to direct his forces. Grant visited his several division commanders, and issued a few verbal orders, but that was about all. Johnston was killed doing the work of a brigadier. As army commanders, neither Grant nor Johnston exerted any influence upon the tactics of this great battle. The Confederate plan to turn the Union left, and hem Grant's army into the pocket of Snake and Owl creeks, was never carried out. An attempt was made to turn both flanks and break the center, all at once, an effort entirely beyond the strength of Johnston's army. The Confederate attack in long lines instead of deep formation was also an error. Corps, divisions, and brigades were soon mixed in hopeless confusion. The action degenerated into a series of isolated combats which without any general plan were ineffective. By 11 o'clock there was not a reserve on the field. On the Federal side the tactics were fully as bad. With no prearranged plan, no line or order of battle, it was impossible to have any concert of action. A regiment was rarely overcome in front, but fell back because the regiment on its right or left had done so, and exposed its flank. It continued its backward movement until it was well under shelter, thus exposing the flank of its neighbor, who then was also compelled to withdraw. Once in operation, the process repeated itself indefinitely. In his own story of the battle, Beauregard admits that he knew on Sunday night that at least 3 of Buell's divisions had arrived. If so, he made a great mistake in staying on the field instead of retreating at once. The battle of the second day was a useless sacrifice of life. Nothing was to be gained by continuing the struggle against such overwhelming odds. In later years, both Grant and Sherman were very sensitive to the criticisms of their failure to pursue the enemy and secure the full fruits of the victory. The explanations given in their memoirs are not at all convincing. Bragg reported the next morning that his troops were utterly disorganized and demoralized. Breckinridge declared, "My troops are worn out, and I don't think can be relied on after the first volley." Grant and Buell had at least 20,000 fresh men to take up the pursuit, which should have resulted in the capture or the complete dispersal of the Confederate army. In answer to an inquiry from Professor Fiske, regarding the failure to pursue the enemy, Sherman after the war made the humorous reply, "I assure you, my dear fellow, we had had quite enough of their society for 2 whole days, and were only too glad to be rid of them on any terms." Grant states that the nature of this battle was such that cavalry could not be used in front. He therefore formed his into line in rear, to stop the numerous stragglers. On the Confederate side, Forrest's men charged a battery, capturing some of the guns, and were of service in compelling the surrender of Prentiss. On Monday they covered the retreat, forming the last line of the rear guard. Although much more should have been accomplished, the results of the campaign were on the whole satisfactory to the national government. Kentucky and all of Tennessee, except the eastern part, were again under Union control. Besides this, the Mississippi was free as far as Vicksburg. To offset these advantages, the Confederate army, which should have been destroyed, was still intact. End of chapter 4. 5. Part 1. July 1861 to June 1862. The Peninsula. Part 1. On the 21st of July, 1861, the streets of Washington were crowded with stragglers from the disastrous field of Manassas, better known as Bull Run. The following day General George B. McClellan was relieved from command of the Army of the West, and on the 27th, by order of President Lincoln, assumed control of the lately defeated troops in the vicinity of the capital. No appointment at that time could have been more acceptable to the people, the press, and the army. George Brinton McClellan was born in Philadelphia on the 3rd of December, 1826. 20 years later he was graduated at West Point, the second in a class in which Stonewall Jackson was 17th. As an engineer with Scott's army in Mexico he won distinction. During the Crimean War he was selected as one of the government's observers, and his report on the campaign was published by special act of Congress. After serving 2 years as captain of the First Cavalry, he resigned, to accept the appointment of chief engineer of the Illinois Central Railroad, of which he soon became vice president. At the outbreak of the war he was president of the Ohio and Mississippi, with headquarters at Cincinnati. In all the various positions he had held, he had shown great zeal and capacity. When the President called for troops after the fall of Sumter, Governor Dennison of Ohio appointed McClellan Major General of the Militia Volunteers of that State, and he organized, equipped, and put in the field the Army of the Ohio. His operations in West Virginia were brief and brilliant, and he was the only Union general who had yet scored a complete success. At the time he was called to Washington, McClellan was a man of fine soldierly appearance and engaging manners, 35 years of age. No better picture of the situation at the capital could be presented than is to be found in the general's own statement. All was chaos and despondency. The city was filled with intoxicated stragglers, and an attack was expected. The troops numbered less than 50,000, many of whom were so demoralized and undisciplined that they could not be relied upon even for defensive purposes. Moreover, the term of service of a large part had already expired, or was on the point of doing so. On the Maryland side of the Potomac, no troops were posted on the roads leading into the city, nor were there any entrenchments. On the Virginia side, the condition of affairs was better in these respects, but far from satisfactory. Sufficient and fit material of war did not exist. The situation was difficult and fraught with danger. General McClellan immediately appointed his general staff, and the work of organizing and equipping a large army was forthwith undertaken. 90 days later, on the 27th October, the general officially reported to the Secretary of War that he had an aggregate strength of 168,318, with 147,695 present for duty. Of this number some 13,000 were only partially armed, leaving an effective force of about 134,000. As the new levies of infantry arrived at Washington, they were formed into provisional brigades, and stationed in the suburbs of the city to be perfected by instruction and discipline. By the opening of the spring of 1862, McClellan had created "as noble a body of men as could have been raised under similar circumstances the world over." Exclusive of the detachments necessary to guard the defenses of Washington, the Potomac, and the lower Shenandoah Valley, which required about 55,000 men, there was a field army 158,000 strong. On the 1st of November, 1861, General Scott retired, and McClellan was appointed to succeed him as commander in chief. But even before this date, McClellan had prepared, at the request of the President, a memorandum setting forth his views as to the proper method of suppressing the rebellion. War all along the line was his purpose. He proposed to strike at the two centers, Richmond in the east and Nashville in the west; while at the same time expeditionary forces were to assail the principal points on the coast and on the Mississippi. Upon these plans the subsequent successful campaigns were practically based. Meantime, the Confederate army under Joseph E. Johnston remained in its position at Manassas, and no steps were taken by McClellan to destroy or dislodge it. The Confederates were also allowed to set up batteries on the lower Potomac, which closed the navigation of the river, and the General refused to take any action to capture them. Finally, the last of October, occurred the unfortunate affair at Ball's Bluff, in which Colonel Baker, who had lately resigned his seat in the Senate, was slain, and nearly all his men were killed or captured. The people of the North could not understand this prolonged inaction, and became impatient. The autumn of 1861 passed, and no move was made. The winter was now at hand, and the roads in Virginia had become almost impassable. To make matters worse, McClellan took typhoid fever and was ill for several weeks in December and January. The government debt was piling up, and had reached over $500 million. Dissatisfaction was general, especially at Washington, in government circles and in Congress. Finally, President Lincoln issued the first of his famous "war orders," in which he directed that the army should advance against Manassas on or before the 22nd of February, a date chosen doubtless for sentimental reasons. This order was not carried into effect, and two other orders were issued by the President, all for the purpose of allaying the popular impatience. At length McClellan was forced to divulge his plans, and on the 8th of March a forward movement on Richmond by way of Urbana was finally decided upon. The very next day, Johnston withdrew his forces from Centreville and the Potomac, and took up a position south of the Rappahannock, with his right at Fredericksburg and his left at Culpeper Court House. The movement placed the Confederate army as near Richmond as the Union forces would be at Urbana, and compelled the abandonment of that route. It was therefore decided to transfer McClellan's army by water to Fort Monroe, which was held by a Federal garrison, and make that fortress the base for an advance on Richmond by way of the Peninsula between the York and James rivers. On the same day that the Urbana plan was approved, an order was issued forming army corps, and assigning the senior general officers to their command. This action was taken without the knowledge of McClellan, and against his judgment that the appointments should have been postponed until the generals had been tried in the field. The organization was as follows: First Corps, McDowell. Divisions, Franklin, McCall, King. Second Corps, Sumner. Divisions, Richardson, Blenker, Sedgwick. Third Corps, Heintzelman. Divisions, Porter, Hooker, and Kearny. Fourth Corps, Keyes. Divisions, Couch, Smith, and Casey. Before leaving for the Peninsula, McClellan decided to march his army out to the abandoned Confederate camps at Centreville, in order "to give the troops a little experience on the march and in bivouac, get rid of extra baggage, and test the working of the staff departments." During this absence an order was published without any previous intimation to McClellan, relieving him from the general command of all the armies, and confining his authority to the Department of the Potomac. Fort Monroe, which McClellan had selected as his base, was a large and very strong work, situated at the southeastern extremity of the peninsula, about 70 miles from Richmond. His original plan of operations was based entirely upon the cooperation of the navy, which he expected not only to carry his supplies, but also to transport his troops up the York or the James, so as to turn and compel the evacuation of each and every line of defense which the enemy might take up. When his army had thus manoeuvred the Confederates back to the immediate vicinity of Richmond, he expected to fight his great battle, destroy the enemy's main army, and capture the capital of the Confederate States. But his expectations regarding the cooperation of the navy, at least for a time, were disappointed. On the 8th of March the Merrimac had steamed out of Norfolk, and sunk 2 Federal frigates in the Hampton Roads. The next day the Ram had engaged the Monitor, and been forced to return to port in a damaged condition. The vessel was not destroyed, however, and the Federal navy advised against any attempt to use the James River. At the same time it was discovered that the Confederates had batteries at Yorktown and Gloucester Point on the York, which the navy could venture neither to attack nor to pass. The peninsula, less than 6 miles wide at its narrowest point, is a low, level, and marshy region. The highways at this time were all dirt roads. The York River, formed by the junction of the Mattapony and the Pamunkey, was navigable up to the junction point where stood West Point, the eastern terminus of the Richmond and York River Railway. Richmond was at the head of navigation on the north bank of the James. The only formidable natural obstacle to an advance up the peninsula was the Chickahominy River and adjacent swamps. This river rises some 15 miles northwest of Richmond, and enters the James about 40 miles below that city. Between Meadow Bridge, north of Richmond, and Bottom's Bridge, directly to the east, the river at its ordinary stage is some 40 feet wide, fringed with a dense growth of heavy forest trees, and bordered by low marshy lands varying from half a mile to a mile in width. Within these limits, the firm ground above high water mark seldom approaches the river on either bank, and in no place on both banks. The river was subject to frequent sudden and violent floods, and a single severe storm, even of brief duration, would cause an overflow of the bottom lands, rendering the river impassable for many days without long and strong bridges. Of nearly all these facts General McClellan was fully aware before he went to the Peninsula; but with his characteristic persistence, he adhered to his original plan, even when circumstances had so changed as to make it no longer equally attractive. Accordingly, during the month of March, the Second, Third, and Fourth Corps were transported to Fort Monroe. McClellan already knew that the works at Yorktown, some 25 miles up the peninsula, were held by Magruder with some 15,000 Confederates; also that Johnston's main army would be able to march promptly to this quarter. He therefore determined to move at once with the force in hand, and endeavor to seize a point, near the Halfway House, between Yorktown and Williamsburg, where the peninsula is reduced to a narrow neck, and thus cut off the retreat of the Yorktown garrison, and prevent the arrival of reinforcements. In reaching this decision, he was misled by the erroneous "Cram" map, which depicts the Warwick River as coming down to Lee's Mills from the north, instead of stretching across the peninsula from Yorktown to the James, as proved to be the case. The forward movement began on the 4th of April in 2 columns, Heintzelman on the road to the right, and Keyes on that to the left. On the following afternoon, both columns had been stopped, the right by the works in front of Yorktown, the left at Lee's Mills, where the Warwick was found to be unfordable and strongly entrenched. By means of several dams Magruder had made the river too deep to ford at almost every point; and he had also constructed a strong line of field works, 13 miles long, entirely across the peninsula. "Thus," says General McClellan, "all things were brought to a standstill, and the intended movement on the Halfway House could not be carried out." In his report McClellan expresses great surprise at this "unexpected" halt; but General Webb says, "Just such a halt ought to have been expected. Nothing less than a continuous front of opposition from the York to the James should have been looked for." McClellan concluded that the line was too strong to be carried by assault, so he brought up Sumner's corps and prepared for a regular siege. At this moment he was also on the point of ordering McDowell's corps to move against Gloucester, when he learned that it had been withdrawn from his command and detained near Washington. This reduced the force of 155,000 upon which he had counted at the beginning of the campaign to about 92,000 men, or some 85,000 present for duty. To make matters even worse, at this time the region from the Alleghanies to the sea was parceled out among 4 independent commanders, and an order was issued from the War Department discontinuing all recruiting for volunteers and closing the recruiting stations. The pernicious policy was also adopted of raising new regiments, instead of maintaining the existing organizations in the field at their full strength. A course more in accordance with well established military principles would have saved the country millions of treasure and thousands of valuable lives. Meanwhile the siege operations had been pushed, and the batteries would have been ready to open fire not later than the morning of the 6th of May, but during the night of the 3rd the enemy evacuated his positions and retreated up the peninsula. About the 1st of May Magruder had been joined by Johnston's army, and the latter took command of the combined Confederate forces. The pursuit of the Confederates was at once taken up by all the available Federal cavalry, supported by 2 divisions of the Third and Fourth Corps. About 2 miles in front of Williamsburg, Magruder had constructed a strong line of defense. Here on the 5th of May the Confederates fought a rear guard action to hold back the Federals until the trains could get well on their way. The battle lasted nearly all day, and that night the Confederates withdrew. The Union advance was delayed by dreadful weather and terrible roads, but by the 16th of May all the corps were within supporting distance, and a new depot was established at White House. On the 18th the Fifth and Sixth Corps were formed, so that the organization of the Army of the Potomac was then as follows: Second Corps, Sumner; divisions, Sedgwick and Richardson; Third Corps, Heintzelman; divisions, Kearny and Hooker; Fourth Corps, Keyes; divisions, Couch and Casey; Fifth Corps, Porter; divisions, Morrell and Sykes; Sixth Corps, Franklin; divisions, Smith and Slocum. The destruction of the Merrimac on the 11th of May had opened the James River, and McClellan wished to use that line for his future operations, but his plan was changed by orders from Washington. On the 18th a telegram from the Secretary of War informed him that McDowell would advance from Fredericksburg, and directed him to extend the right of the Army of the Potomac to the north of Richmond, so as to establish communications with McDowell's corps. The same order directed McClellan to maintain his base at White House. To these orders McClellan attributes the failure of his campaign, and there is certainly great weight in his contention. Mr. Ropes says: "Petersburg was absolutely undefended, and could be occupied without opposition. This last line of operations was in truth the one which promised the best results. If Petersburg should be occupied in force by the Federals, it is hard to see how the Confederates could expect long to retain their hold on Richmond." The Confederate authorities were well aware that McClellan's army, apart from McDowell's corps, outnumbered that of Johnston nearly 3-2, the latter being only about 50,000 strong. And the situation seemed so desperate, that the preparations were made for the removal of the military papers from Richmond. The greatest danger was apprehended from the advance of McDowell's corps from Fredericksburg upon the flank of Johnston's army, and it was determined to do everything possible to prevent this movement. General Lee, who was in general charge of the military operations of the Confederacy, accordingly sent Ewell's division to reinforce Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. To avoid interrupting the narrative of events in the Peninsula, the story of Jackson's operations in the Shenandoah has not yet been told. Soon after the battle of Bull Run, Jackson was promoted to the rank of Major General, and on the 28th October, 1861, he was ordered to Winchester to assume command of the Valley district. The Shenandoah Valley has already been described in some detail. On its eastern or exposed flank it was covered by the Blue Ridge Mountains, which could only be crossed at certain gaps, through most of which there were good roads. The valley was connected with Richmond by 2 lines of railway: the Manassas Gap, mentioned in connection with the Manassas campaign, and the Virginia Central, running from Staunton by way of Rockfish Gap, Charlottesville, and Gordonsville. A good system of roads connected all of the towns and villages. The main thoroughfare was the Valley Turnpike, stretching from Staunton, near the head of the valley, to Martinsburg at its lower end, a distance of 120 miles. The main valley, averaging about 20 miles in width, is closed on the western side by the Alleghanies. The two forks of the Shenandoah River in the upper part of the valley flow parallel to each other, about 8 miles apart, for a distance of 40 or 50 miles, but separated by an isolated ridge called Massanutten Mountain, as high as the Blue Ridge. At Strasburg this ridge drops suddenly to the level of the valley, and the North Fork of the Shenandoah sweeps around its base and joins the South Fork at Front Royal. The Shenandoah, thus formed, flows along the very base of the Blue Ridge to Harper's Ferry, where it enters the Potomac. Jackson's command at first consisted only of a weak body of militia. But he was soon reinforced with his old brigade, and later with 6,000 poorly disciplined troops under Loring. These, with Ashby's cavalry, raised his forces to about 10,000 men. The Union troops in this district, about 18,000 strong, were commanded by General Banks, whose headquarters were at Frederick City, in Maryland. General Kelley, with a detachment of 5,000 men, garrisoned Romney, a town about 35 miles northwest of Winchester by a good road. In January, Jackson marched against this point, hoping to capture the Federal force, but it escaped. This operation, which was attended by great hardships, amounted to nothing in the end. During the winter, from various causes, Jackson's little army was greatly reduced, so that at the beginning of March he did not have over 5,000 men available. Having retired up the valley, he learned that the enemy had begun to withdraw troops and send them to McClellan. He resolved to check this by a demonstration against Winchester, then occupied by General Shields with a Union force of some 10,000 men. On the 23d of March, Jackson occupied a ridge at the hamlet of Kernstown, 4 miles south of Winchester. Here he was attacked by Shields, and finally forced to retreat, after a severe engagement of several hours. The pursuit was not vigorous, and Jackson retired in good order to the vicinity of Swift Run Gap. Although defeated, Jackson had succeeded in his object of stopping the withdrawal of Federal troops from the valley, and General Lee was so pleased that he decided to reinforce the valley army by sending Ewell's division to Jackson, thus giving him an aggregate force of some 15,000 men. On the 1st of May the situation was as follows. Milroy was at McDowell, about 40 miles from Staunton, with a Union force of 4,000 men, and Schenck's brigade of 2,500 was near Franklin, where 20,000 troops of Fremont's army were concentrating. Banks had fortified Strasburg, 70 miles northeast of Staunton on the turnpike, and had pushed forward a force of 20,000 men to Harrisonburg. The total Union forces in the valley under various commanders aggregated not less than 65,000 men. Jackson decided first to strike Milroy's detachment, and then turn against Banks. To mask his movement, he marched over the mountains to a small station a few miles west of Charlottesville, leaving friends and foes to think that he was en route for Richmond. Cars were waiting for his troops, but instead of going east, the trains went west to Staunton. Jackson immediately started his troops on the road from Staunton to McDowell, where, on the 8th of May, he fought a severe and bloody engagement with Milroy and Schenck. The Federals were defeated, and fled toward Franklin to unite with Fremont. Jackson then returned to the valley, leaving his cavalry under Ashby in front of Fremont to screen the movement. Chapter 5, Part 2. July, 1861 to June, 1862. The Peninsula. Part 2. In the meantime, Banks had fallen back to Strasburg. Shields' division had been sent to General McDowell, and he had only 8,000 men, of whom he had placed 1,000 under Colonel Kenly at Front Royal, while he himself was entrenched at Strasburg with the remainder. On the 21st May, Jackson started northward with his little army along the turnpike, but suddenly turned to the right, and crossed the Massanutten to Luray. On the morning of the 22d he took the road down the valley, and the next day fell upon Kenly's detachment at Front Royal. The Federal force was almost entirely wiped out, 154 being killed or wounded, and 600 captured. The Confederate losses were only 11 killed and 15 wounded. Banks retreated to Winchester, where he made a useless stand, to test the strength of the enemy, and then withdrew across the Potomac. After a rest of 2 days, Jackson advanced to within 3 miles of Harper's Ferry, to increase the fear at the north, and to give his wagons, with the spoils of Winchester, time to get away on the road to Staunton. Returning by train to Winchester ahead of his army, Jackson learned on the 30th May that Shields, commanding McDowell's vanguard, had captured Front Royal; also that Fremont was 25 miles west of the Valley Turnpike, on the road from Moorefield to Strasburg. Winchester is only 18 miles from Strasburg, but Jackson's troops were from 7 to 20 miles further back on the pike. Banks, in his rear, had 15,000 men; Fremont also 15,000; and Shields 10,000, with 10,000 more a few miles behind. Jackson had only 15,000 troops to meet these 50,000 Federals, and he was encumbered with 2,000 prisoners, besides a double train of wagons 7 miles long. He was in a trap, and nothing but the incompetency of the Union commanders saved him. None of them knew the exact location of the other Federal detachments, and they all stood in awe of Jackson. Fremont was checked by Ashby's cavalry 6 miles west of Strasburg, and Shields was kept back on the east by a small brigade. Jackson concentrated his troops at once, and on the 31st of May his main body bivouacked at Strasburg. The next morning, Ewell's division relieved the cavalry in front of Fremont, and kept him back until the trains and the Stonewall Brigade had passed. That night the whole command was at Woodstock, with Ashby's cavalry protecting the rear. The forces of McDowell and Fremont did not get into communication with each other until the 2d of June, when both columns took up the pursuit, Shields by the Luray Valley, and Fremont by the Turnpike, on opposite sides of the Massanuttons. In anticipation of these movements, Jackson had destroyed the 3 bridges on the South Fork, to the north of Port Republic, and sent a detachment to hold the bridge at that place for the retreat of his own army. On the 4th of June, the Confederates crossed the North Fork, and burnt the bridge. Heavy rains in the valley which raised the river made it difficult for the Federals to throw over a pontoon bridge, and this gave Jackson a lead of 24 hours. In a desperate skirmish on the 6th, Ashby was shot through the heart. The death of no other man save Jackson could have caused so great a loss to the army. He was the first cavalry leader in this war, or in any war since the time of Napoleon, to use his squadrons right. The night of the 7th of June, the hostile forces were thus situated. Shields' command was stretched out over 25 miles of road in Luray Valley; Fremont was at Harrisonburg; Ewell's Confederate division was near Cross Keys, and Jackson's main body was near Port Republic. Jackson might now have easily made good his escape, but he had other plans in view. He proposed to hold Fremont back at Cross Keys with Ewell's division, while he crushed Shields with his main body, then to fall upon Fremont with his entire force. On the 8th June, Fremont attacked Ewell at Cross Keys. Not knowing where Shields was, and supposing that Jackson's entire army was in front of him, the Federal commander made his attack in a timid, half-hearted fashion, only employing 5 of his 24 regiments present on the field. The Federals were repulsed, and the action was not renewed. At an early hour the following day Jackson set out to attack Shields. About 2 miles down the river from Port Republic, he encountered 2 Federal brigades under Tyler in a strong position. Here the battle of Port Republic took place. After a fierce action, which lasted for 4 or 5 hours, Tyler was driven off the field. In his retreat he met Shields, hurrying with the remainder of his division to the sound of the battle. Shields formed line and stopped the pursuit. Before midnight, Jackson's entire army was in bivouac at Brown's Gap, where it remained until it set out on the 17th upon its swift and secret journey to Richmond. The Valley campaign was at an end. During the period of 14 days, from the morning of the 19th of May to the night of the 1st of June, Jackson's army marched 170 miles, routed forces aggregating 12,500 men, threatened the North with invasion, drew off McDowell from Fredericksburg, and finally, though surrounded on 3 sides by 50,000 Federals, brought off a huge convoy without losing a single wagon. Lee had been the first to recognize the weak joint in the enemy's armor. the national anxiety for Washington. Kernstown induced Lincoln to form four independent armies, each acting on a different line. 2 months later, when McClellan was in front of Richmond, and it was most important that these armies be combined, Jackson drove Banks across the Potomac, and again the Federal concentration was prevented. Finally, the battles of Cross Keys and Port Republic led Mr. Lincoln to make his worst mistake, and McClellan was left isolated when he most needed help. The brains of two great leaders, Lee and Jackson, had done more for the Confederacy than 200,000 soldiers had done for the Union. From this instance it may be deduced that Providence is sometimes more inclined to side with the big brains than with the big battalions. A week after Cross Keys and Port Republic, Jackson had vanished from the Valley; and when he appeared on the Chickahominy, Banks, Fremont, and McDowell were still guarding the roads to Washington, and McClellan was waiting for McDowell. 175,000 men absolutely paralyzed by 16,000. Only Napoleon's campaign of 1814 affords a parallel to this extraordinary spectacle. "These brilliant successes," writes Lord Wolseley, "appear to me models of their kind both in conception and execution. They should be closely studied by all officers who wish to learn the art and science of war." The use Jackson made of his cavalry was perhaps the most brilliant tactical feature of the Valley campaign. Such tactics had not been seen since the days of Napoleon. The great cloud of horsemen which veiled the march of the grand army had been forgotten. The vast importance ascribed by the Emperor to procuring early information of his enemy, and hiding his own movements, had been overlooked; and it was left to an American soldier to revive his methods. To return now to the Peninsula. On the 17th of May, McClellan resumed his advance on Richmond, and encountered but little resistance, as Johnston had withdrawn to the further side of the Chickahominy. The army moved very leisurely, taking 3 days to cover the 12 miles from White House to the river. By the 25th the corps of Heintzelman and Keyes had crossed at Bottom's Bridge, and taken position on the south side of the stream. The 3 other corps remained on the north side, extending from the railway to the Mechanicsville road. This dangerous position, astride the Chickahominy, was taken by McClellan when he was expecting to be rejoined by McDowell, but was not changed even after he was advised that McDowell would not join him. Bridges were built to facilitate communication between the two wings of the army, but they were liable at any time to be carried away by high water. In order to secure his line of communications by the York River Railway, and to clear his right flank and rear of the enemy, on the 27th May, McClellan dispatched Porter against Branch's brigade of Confederates, which was at Hanover Court House, 14 miles north of Richmond. The objects of the expedition were accomplished; and after destroying the bridges and railroad as far as Ashland, Porter returned to his old camps. This affair has been termed a "useless battle," but General Webb considers the moral effects of that success to have been of the greatest importance in the subsequent battle of Gaines' Mill. Johnston's army was now within the intrenchments before Richmond. Having received some reinforcements, it was about 63,000 strong. The army, which had not yet been divided into corps, was organized in 4 strong divisions, under Longstreet, D. H. Hill, Magruder, and Smith; 2 small divisions under A. P. Hill and Huger, and Stewart's cavalry. Johnston's first plan was to attack that part of McClellan's army which lay north of the Chickahominy, but when he learned that McDowell had been sent to the Valley, he decided to destroy the 2 Federal corps which had crossed the river, and were encamped within a few miles of Richmond. He accordingly issued orders for his troops to be in position to attack at daybreak on the 31st of May. On this day the Federal position was as follows: Casey's division of the Fourth Corps (Keyes) occupied some rifle pits and a redoubt about 3/4 of a mile west of Seven Pines, a tavern on the Williamsburg stage road. The other division, under Couch, was a little to the right and rear. Heintzelman's Third Corps had not advanced much beyond the Chickahominy. The division of Kearny was at Bottom's Bridge, 5 miles from Casey's advance line, and Hooker's division was 7 miles to the south, guarding White Oak Bridge. Each of these 4 divisions numbered about 8,500 men. It is apparent that General Heintzelman, who was in command of both corps, had not sufficiently concentrated his forces. To the south of the stage road the ground was swampy, and this gave some protection to the Union left. But to the north, as far as Fair Oaks Station on the York River Railroad, the country was favorable. It was, of course, to be expected that McClellan would throw his Second Corps under Sumner across the river, but the Confederate plans were favored by a violent storm on the afternoon and night of the 30th, which rendered the river unfordable, and made the bridges unsafe for the passage of men and guns. Johnston's plan was simple, and should have been effective. Longstreet was to command the main attack, which was to fall upon the troops at Fair Oaks and Seven Pines. He was to move by the 9 Mile road, D. H. Hill by the Williamsburg road, and Huger by the Charles City road. Smith's division was to remain at the road fork near Old Tavern, to protect the Confederate left against any movement from the north side of the river. Magruder and A. P. Hill were to remain in position north of the Chickahominy. The whole plan miscarried, through Longstreet's misunderstanding of his orders, which were given him verbally. He got part of his division on the Charles City road in front of Huger, and part on the stage road in rear of D. H. Hill. Instead of attacking at daybreak, it was 1 o'clock before the action began, and then D. H. Hill attacked alone. At first the Confederates gained some advantage, but after several hours Kearny came up with his division, and the Union line of battle was reestablished. Later, Hill was reinforced by one of Longstreet's brigades, and the Federals were driven back to a point 1.5 miles east of Seven Pines, where the battle this part of the line ceased at about 6:30. Huger's division and 6 of Longstreet's brigades had scarcely fired a shot. But there was a sharp engagement about 5 o'clock near Fair Oaks, between Smith's division and part of Sumner's corps, which had marched to Keyes' assistance by way of Grapevine Bridge. The Confederates were repulsed with heavy loss, and the troops of Sumner remained masters of the field. Before sundown Johnston recognized that his attack was a failure, and he was about to suspend the action, when he received 2 severe wounds. He was carried from the field, and was incapacitated for service until the middle of November. G. W. Smith, the next in rank, assumed command of the Confederate army, and he ordered Longstreet to renew the attack as soon after daybreak as practicable. Longstreet's attack was feebly made, and was repulsed with heavy loss. This ended the battle. General McClellan arrived on the field early in the afternoon, but gave no orders for an attack. About 2 o'clock, General Lee appeared at Smith's headquarters, and, by orders from President Davis, assumed command of the Confederate army. That night he withdrew the troops within the defenses of Richmond. General Smith, on account of illness, retired temporarily from active duty, and Whiting took command permanently of his division. In the battle of Seven Pines, or Fair Oaks, as it is variously called, the Confederates lost about 6,000 men, and the Federals 5,000. The attack was a complete failure, and left the Confederates in a very disheartened condition. Lee set his men to work strengthening the lines in front of Richmond, and their spirits soon revived, with the sense of security that this gave them. At the time of his appointment to the command of the Army of Northern Virginia, General Lee was 55 years of age, in perfect health, vigorous and robust. As military adviser to the President, a position similar to that of Chief of the General Staff, he had won the full confidence of his chief; but it is a mistake to say that at this time he possessed the unquestioning and enthusiastic devotion of the army. His only active service had been in West Virginia in the autumn of 1861, and this campaign had generally been considered a failure. His appointment, therefore, did not at once inspire popular enthusiasm. As he had fought no battles in West Virginia, there was quite a general impression that he would not be an aggressive commander, and this was strengthened when he set his men to work on the fortifications of Richmond. This action, to some of his amateur critics in the public press, seemed a confession of cowardice. Only a few people who knew him well, then believed that he had the audacity to assume the offensive, to run greater risks, and take more desperate chances than any other general, North or South. These doubts, however, were soon removed, and long before the end of the war, Lee's position was unique. No other commander on either side was so universally believed in, so absolutely trusted. "Nor was there ever a commander," says Mr. Ropes, "who better deserved the support of his government and the affection and confidence of his soldiers." During the first 3 weeks of June neither army made any aggressive movement. Lee was engaged in strengthening the defenses of Richmond, and McClellan employed his troops in building bridges to connect the wings of his army. These bridges had to be long enough to cross not only the Chickahominy itself, but the marshes on either side, and the task involved no little labor and difficulty. It was, moreover, aggravated by the bad weather which prevailed during the first half of June. McClellan also constructed elaborate field works on the south side of the river, which completely covered the front from Golding's Farm to White Oak Swamp, and rendered this part of the Federal line practically impregnable. Works were also thrown up on the north side, behind Beaver Dam Creek. The 2 corps of Sumner and Franklin were permanently established on the south side of the river, and only the 5th Corps, of Fitz John Porter, remained on the north side. On the 20th of June the bridges had been completed, and the weather was fine. This was obviously McClellan's time to attack, if he ever intended to do so. He had received reinforcements which had brought his army up to an aggregate of 105,000 men, and there was no immediate prospect of a further increase in numbers. It was plain that the chances of success were better now than they would be after General Lee was strengthened by the arrival of Jackson's command from the Shenandoah. At this time Lee only had 68,000 men within the lines of Richmond, and McClellan outnumbered him by more than 3-2. These odds, according to Napoleon, are sufficient, and if a general cannot discover from the attitude of his enemy what the odds are, he is unfitted for supreme command. McClellan was a man of undoubted ability, but his good qualities were accompanied by marked defects. Bold in conception, he was terribly slow in execution. His will was less powerful than his imagination. Lee had served on the same staff with McClellan in the Mexican War, and had personal knowledge of his capacity and character. He read him like an open book. McClellan, on the other hand, failed to draw a single correct inference. It is true that he was misled by his famous detective staff, and believed the garrison of Richmond to number at least 200,000 men. But he made no effort whatever to supplement or check up this information. It must be admitted that his cavalry, which numbered only 5,000 sabers, was weak in proportion to his other arms, and also of inferior quality, but he scarcely employed it at all. Lee, on the other hand, had found means to acquire ample information of the disposition of his adversary's forces on the north bank of the Chickahominy, the point he had decided to attack. His cavalry also was below the usual proportion of 1 trooper to every 6 men of the other arms, numbering not more than 3,000; but it was of superior quality, familiar with the country, and united under the command of J. E. B. Stuart, one of the ablest cavalry leaders developed during the Civil War. Early on the 12th of June, with 1,200 horsemen and a section of artillery, Stuart rode out on an enterprise of a kind which at that time was absolutely unique, and which will keep his memory green so long as cavalry is used in war. He encountered and defeated a small Federal force near Old Church, and reached Tunstall's Station on the York River Railroad without further opposition. He had then accomplished the object of the expedition, which was to ascertain the nature of the region lying north of the Chickahominy, and the arrangements of McClellan to protect his line of supplies. Stuart now realized that it would be dangerous, if not impossible, to return to Richmond by the route by which he had come, so he determined to make a complete circuit of the Union army. This feat he successfully accomplished, crossing the Chickahominy 15 miles below Bottom's Bridge, and reaching Richmond by way of the James River road on the 15th. He had marched nearly 150 miles in 4 days, captured many prisoners, and lost but 1 man. On the whole, however, this brilliant raid cost the Confederates more than its results were worth. It seriously alarmed McClellan for his line of supplies, and he immediately gave orders to begin loading the transports preparatory to a change of base to Harrison's Landing on the James River. If these preliminary arrangements had not been made, the results of the campaign would have been much more favorable to the Confederates. At the same time, McClellan caused a survey to be made by his engineers of the region between the railroad and White Oak Swamp. From the data furnished by these officers, maps were prepared for use in case the movement to the James should be found advisable. General Lee had also been largely reinforced during the month of June, and when joined by Jackson would dispose of 86,500 men. He now decided to take the offensive, and made arrangements for the cooperation of Jackson, which was essential to the success of such a movement. At this time, the Federal troops in the Shenandoah had fallen back, and no further trouble from them was anticipated for the time being. Jackson was therefore ordered to leave a small force to guard the passes, and to join the main army as soon as possible, moving east to Ashland on the Richmond and Fredericksburg Railroad. Before issuing on the 24th of June the orders for the battle of Gaines' Mill General Orders No. 75, General Lee called a conference at his headquarters of Jackson, Longstreet, A. P. Hill, and D. H. Hill, to arrange all details. When summoned to this meeting on Saturday, 21st June, Jackson was near Gordonsville. He started on a freight train bound to Richmond, but left the train before midnight that night at a station, where he spent Sunday, attending church twice. At midnight he set out on horseback for the conference at Richmond, some 50 miles away, arriving about 3 o'clock Monday afternoon. If he had kept on the train he would have reached Richmond early Sunday morning. His infantry followed by train, but the artillery and cavalry marched all the way. His brigades on the march also kept Sunday in camp as usual. At the conference, Longstreet asked Jackson to fix the date for the attack, and he named the 25th of June; but on Longstreet's suggestion that he allow more time, the 26th was selected. CHAPter VI.